The man didn't even look at her when he said it. Gerald Fitch, owner of Coldwater Station's only boarding house, stood behind his counter with both hands flat on the wood, staring at the woman who had just walked through his door with a travel trunk and a ticket stub, and he said it loud enough for the entire room to hear. "We don't accommodate women of your size. You'll break the beds." 3 men at the corner table laughed. A woman near the window looked away. The clerk didn't blink. Mabel Whitlock stood in the doorway of that boarding house with dust from a 14-hour stage ride still on her coat, holding the handle of her trunk like it was the only solid thing left in the world, and she did not cry. She had stopped crying about things like this a long time ago. She just looked at Gerald Fitch and said, "Then I'll sit in your lobby until my party arrives." He told her the lobby wasn't for waiting. She sat down anyway. If you're watching this story for the first time, hit that like button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this tale has traveled. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens when this mountain finally gives up its secrets. Because what Mabel found at the top of that ridge? Nobody in Coldwater saw it coming, not even her. The stage from Denver arrived in Coldwater Station on a Thursday in late September, 1883. And it brought with it 6 passengers, 40 pounds of sorted mail, a crate of medicinal supplies for the mining company, and Mabel Whitlock. She was the last one off. Not because she was slow, she had simply learned over the course of 29 years that getting off last meant fewer people watching, fewer elbows in her way, fewer comments spoken just loud enough to be heard. The other passengers had already collected their bags and drifted toward the station platform by the time Mabel stepped down from the coach, one hand gripping the iron rail, her travel trunk bumping behind her. Coldwater was not what she had pictured. She had pictured something rougher, rawer. And it was rough, no question, with its muddy main street and its competing smells of horse and coal smoke and something frying in a pan somewhere nearby. But it was also busier than she expected. Men with picks and dirty coats moved between buildings. Women bargained at a dry goods counter visible through an open doorway. Children chased a dog between the water trough and the livery fence. Mabel stood on the platform with her trunk and her one leather satchel and her letter from Rowan Ashcroft folded into the inside pocket of her coat, and she looked around for someone who might look like a man who had written what he wrote. His letters had been plain. Unusually plain, she thought, compared to the letters other women described receiving from their prospective husbands through the correspondence agency in Springfield. Most of the men, from what she heard, wrote with ambition or charm, or at least attempted flattery. Rowan Ashcroft had written neither. His first letter had been 3 paragraphs long and had told her, without apology, that his ranch was in the mountains above the town at an elevation most people found discouraging, that winters were long and sometimes brutal, that he had no neighbors within reasonable distance, and that he required a woman capable of genuine work rather than decorative company. He had not described himself. He had not asked her to describe herself. At the bottom of the 3rd paragraph, in handwriting that was careful and a little cramped, he had written, "I am not looking for someone perfect. I am looking for someone honest. If that interests you, write back." She had written back. That had been 4 months ago. They had exchanged 7 letters in total. In none of them had he asked about her appearance, and in none of them had she volunteered it. She was not naive about what that omission might mean when he finally saw her. The platform was thinning out. The other passengers had moved on, and the station agent was eyeing her trunk with the particular impatience of someone who needed the space. Mabel picked up her satchel, flagged a boy with a cart to help with the trunk, and made her way toward the boarding house 2 blocks up the main street, because the letter had said Rowan would arrive in town by mid-afternoon, and she was early by 2 hours. That was when she met Gerald Fitch. The boarding house was a 2-story clapboard building with a painted sign that had faded at the edges. A pair of chairs sat on the porch, both occupied by men who watched her approach with the particular stillness of people who have decided already what they think. Mabel climbed the porch steps without looking at either of them, pushed open the front door, and walked to the counter. Gerald Fitch was a wiry man in his 50s with a mustache that needed trimming and the look of someone who had run a small establishment long enough to believe he was entitled to his opinions. He looked at Mabel over the counter. He took her in, all of her, slowly, the way some people did when they wanted you to know they were doing it. And then he said what he said. We don't accommodate women of your size. You'll break the beds. The room wasn't large. There were 4 men at a corner table with coffee cups. There was a woman near the single window mending something in her lap. There was a boy sweeping near the back wall who stopped sweeping. They all heard it. Mabel set her satchel down on the floor beside the counter. She kept her voice even and quiet, which was something she had learned to do because it unnerved people more than raising it. She said, "Then I'll sit in your lobby until my party arrives." Fitch said, "This lobby isn't for waiting." "Then call it whatever you like," Mabel said, and she picked up her satchel and walked to the chair farthest from the counter and sat down in it. Fitch stared at her. She looked at the wall across from her with perfect calm. After a moment, he made a sound low in his throat and went back to whatever he had been doing behind the counter, and Mabel sat in the chair with her hands folded in her lap and her heart going harder than she would have liked, and she waited. The woman by the window caught her eye and gave her a look that was somewhere between sympathy and embarrassment, the kind of look people gave when they had witnessed something unkind but hadn't said anything about it. Mabel gave her a small nod and looked away. She didn't need the sympathy. She needed the chair. The 2 hours passed. In that time, 3 different people came in and out of the boarding house lobby, and each of them looked at Mabel in the chair with varying degrees of curiosity. One of the men from the corner table, heavy-set himself, with a red beard and calloused hands, paused near her chair on his way out and said, quietly, "Fitch has a mouth on him. Don't let it stick." Mabel looked up at him. "It won't," she said. He nodded and went out. She appreciated that more than she showed. At 2:30, the door opened and a man walked in who was not what she expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. She had formed no clear picture from his letters. She had tried not to, deliberately, because she had learned that pictures formed in the mind had a way of becoming standards against which the real thing inevitably fell short. He was tall, taller than average, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had started to go gray at the temples, and a face that had spent years outdoors and showed it. He wore a coat that was clean but patched at one elbow, trousers that fit well but were not new, and boots that had been resoled at least once. He moved through the door with the particular economy of someone who did not waste motion, looked around the lobby once, and found her. He did not look surprised. He did not look pleased or displeased. He looked at her the way a man looks when he is taking in information before deciding what to do with it, and then he walked toward her and stopped 3 feet away and said, "Miss Whitlock." "Mr. Ashcroft," she said. There was a pause that lasted maybe 4 seconds, which is a long time when 2 strangers are looking at each other for the first time after 4 months of letters. Then he said, "You've been waiting." "About 2 hours," she said. "Your man at the counter there wouldn't give me a room." Rowan Ashcroft turned and looked at Gerald Fitch behind the counter. Fitch had gone still in the way people go still when they realize they may have miscalculated something. Rowan looked at him for a moment without expression and then turned back to Mabel. "I don't use this house anyway," he said. "I have a wagon outside. Are you ready?" She looked at him. "You're not going to say anything to him?" "I was going to ask you the same thing," Rowan said. Mabel considered that. Then she picked up her satchel, stood up from the chair, and said, "I already said what I needed to." Something in Rowan Ashcroft's face shifted, barely, just a slight adjustment around the eyes. And he picked up her trunk himself, without asking if she needed help, and carried it to the door. Outside on the porch, one of the men who had been sitting in the chairs when she arrived was still there. He looked at Rowan and then at Mabel and then said, with a smirk he didn't bother to hide, "That your mail-order bride, Ashcroft? Lord help you in the winter when there's no room to move around the kitchen." Rowan stopped walking. He set the trunk down on the porch boards. He turned and looked at the man with the kind of patience that is not actually patience at all, but something quieter and more deliberate underneath it, and he said, "You want to be careful about what you say next." The man shrugged, but he didn't say anything next. Rowan picked the trunk back up and kept walking. Mabel followed him down the porch steps and out to the street. She didn't say anything until they reached the wagon, where a horse, a solid gray gelding, patient and thick-necked, stood hitched to the rail. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Rowan said. He swung the trunk up into the wagon bed with less effort than she would have expected. I did it anyway. She looked at him. Get comfortable, he said, nodding at the wagon bench. It's about 4 hours up. She climbed onto the bench and settled herself. He untied the horse, climbed up on the other side, and they pulled out into the street. As they turned north and began moving away from the buildings, she heard voices behind them. Not loud, not clear, but the particular murmur of people talking about what they had just seen. She had heard that murmur before, all her life. She had learned to keep walking. The road out of Coldwater moved north and then began climbing almost immediately, switching back against the first real grade within half a mile. The mountains ahead were enormous and close in the way that mountains in Colorado are always closer than they look from lower ground. Layered blue and gray and dark green, the peaks already capped with early snow that wouldn't melt now until spring. Rowan drove without talking much, which suited Mabel fine. She was not a woman who needed noise to feel comfortable. She had spent enough of her life surrounded by people who talked a great deal without saying very much. After perhaps 20 minutes on the road, he said, "The letters. You read them carefully?" "Several times," she said. "I wasn't exaggerating anything. The winters up here are real." "I know," she said. "Most people, when I say brutal, they think they understand it, and they don't." She turned and looked at him. "I grew up in northern Illinois, Mr. Ashcroft. I know what a real winter is." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Fair enough." They passed a mining camp off to the left of the road, a cluster of rough buildings and equipment and men in dirty coats moving between them. A few of them looked up as the wagon passed. Mabel noticed one of them nudge another and point. She looked straight ahead. "That happened to you a lot?" Rowan asked. He was looking at the road. "Frequently," she said. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly, which was something she made a point of doing when people asked real questions. "Yes," she said. "I'd be lying if I said no, but I've learned not to let it change what I do." He nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else about it, and she didn't either, and somehow that felt like the most respectful response she could have received. The road climbed steadily. The aspens along the lower slopes had gone yellow gold with the season, whole hillsides of them shimmering in the afternoon light. The wagon wheels found every rock and root in the track, and Mabel held the bench rail and kept her balance without complaint, watching the landscape change as they gained elevation. The air was colder already. She buttoned her coat to the top. After another 30 minutes, they stopped at a relay point, a rough shelter with a water trough and a woodpile, where Rowan watered the horse and checked the harness. Mabel climbed down to stretch her legs and stood looking back down the slope they had climbed. Coldwater was already invisible, swallowed by the terrain and the distance. Ahead, the track wound up through a stand of dark pines before disappearing around a granite shoulder of the mountain. "How much farther?" she asked. "2 hours, maybe a bit more. There's a last grade before the top that's steep. Might want to walk it if the wagon feels uncertain." She looked at the grade in the distance. "Is it usually uncertain?" "Depends on the load." He said it plainly, without edge in it, and she understood he was not making a comment about her weight. He was talking about the trunk, the supplies loaded in the wagon bed. Still, she watched his face for the flinch that sometimes came after people said things like that, the small recalibration of a man who had realized what his words might sound like. There was none. He was already checking the trace lines again, his attention entirely on the horse. She decided she respected that. They kept climbing, the pines closed around them and the light changed, going filtered and dim and cold-smelling with sap and stone. The road here was barely a road at all. 2 ruts worn into the rocky ground by years of the same wagon taking the same route. Mabel found herself wondering how he managed supplies in deep winter. She started running the problem in her head. What quantity of provisions you would need to put up before the pass is closed, how long a hard winter could run, what would happen if the wagon couldn't make the grade under heavy snow. She had always done this, worked problems she had not yet been asked to solve. Her mother had called it a nervous habit. Mabel had come to think of it differently. "Do you lay in all your winter supplies before the first snow closes the pass?" she asked. Rowan looked at her sideways. "You've been thinking about that since the relay point." "Since we passed the mining camp," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, everything comes up before the first hard freeze. After that, we're on our own until March." "How many men on the ranch?" 7 through winter, more in summer for the grazing drives. She was calculating. 7 men, 5 months minimum, high elevation with serious cold. What's your typical provision weight, and where do you store it? Root cellar or outbuilding? Rowan looked at her again. This time the look lasted longer. Root cellar, he said, but it's never felt like quite enough. It probably isn't, she said. Root cellars lose cold when you access them too frequently through winter. You want a separate ice cellar for long-term cold storage and daily access from a smaller, better insulated house store. He said nothing for a moment. The horse picked its way around a section of washed-out road, and he handled the reins with the practiced ease of a man who had driven this track hundreds of times. Then he said, "Where did you learn that?" "My family kept a large kitchen garden and supplied 2 neighboring families through 3 winters when I was a girl," Mabel said. "My father was sick for a long stretch. I learned what we needed." Rowan turned back to the road. "You're not what I pictured," he said. "Neither are you," she said. "What did you picture?" She considered. "Older," she said. "More beard." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, just a slight change at the corners of his mouth. But she caught it. "What did you picture?" she asked. "I didn't," he said. "I stopped picturing things a while back. Made the disappointments easier." There was something in that sentence that was not self-pity. It was something older and more settled than that. The particular flatness of a person who has revised their expectations downward enough times that they have stopped expecting things altogether. Mabel had met that quality before. She recognized it. She said, "That's a hard way to live." He said, "It's a practical one." She didn't argue with him. Not yet. There would be time enough for arguing. The track broke out of the pines onto a long, open stretch of rocky slope, and the wind hit them immediately, colder and sharper than anything below, with a quality to it that made Mabel's eyes water. She tucked her chin into her collar and held on as the wagon lurched across the rough ground. To the left of the track, the mountain fell away sharply, and through the gap Mabel could see the valley far below, a patchwork of brown and gold fields, the thin line of a river, the smudge of cold water in the distance. The scale of what they had climbed surprised her, even though she had been climbing it. From down there, this road would be invisible. "The steep grade is ahead," Rowan said. "About a quarter mile. You can walk if you want. Or you can stay seated, your decision." "I'll stay seated," she said. "It's genuinely steep," he said. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, "I have never made decisions based on avoiding difficult things. I'm not starting now." He looked at her, held it a moment, then looked back at the road. "All right," he said. The grade was, in fact, genuinely steep. The gelding dug in with its haunches and heaved, and the wagon tipped back at an angle that felt alarming, and Mabel gripped the bench rail and leaned forward slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. And they went up, the wheels scraping granite, the horse blowing hard. The whole enterprise feeling for approximately 90 seconds like it might simply slide backward and keep sliding. Then they crested. And Mabel Whitlock looked out over what lay beyond and forgot, momentarily, how cold she was. The ridge she had just crested was the outer wall of something that she had no word for except, after a moment, impossible. Because on the other side, instead of more rocky slope and pine and mountain severity, there was a valley, a real valley, wide and green even in late September, cupped by the mountains on 3 sides, with a stream cutting silver across the floor of it and meadows that somehow looked lush this high up. And at the center of it all, a ranch. Not the weathered cabin she had been prepared for. Not the struggling one-man operation that the people in Coldwater had described. What she saw was a substantial stone house, long and solid, built to last, 3 outbuildings visible from this angle, a large barn, fences that ran in organized lines across the valley floor, sheep grazing in a far meadow, horses in a closer pen. It was not a poor man's ranch. It was not, in any possible reading, a poor man's ranch. Mabel sat on the wagon bench and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Beside her, Rowan had the reins loose in his hands and was looking at the valley the way a man looks at something he has looked at 1,000 times and still doesn't entirely take for granted. She said quietly, "You told me you had a ranch in the mountains." "I do," he said. "You told me it was humble work." "The work is humble," he said. "Work is work regardless of what it earns you." She turned and looked at him directly. "You let me come up here thinking you were barely scraping by." I let the town think that, he said. You. I told the truth. I said I lived simply. I said the life was hard. Both of those things are still true. He paused. I never said I was poor. She looked back at the valley. She looked at the stone house, the organized fences, the healthy animals in the distance. Why? She asked. Rowan was quiet for a moment. The gelding shifted its weight, impatient to move downslope toward home. Because, he said, I wanted to know, before you got here, whether you were coming for the ranch or for the life. Mabel sat with that. Down below, the stream caught the late afternoon light and turned briefly gold. One of the horses in the near pen lifted its head and looked up toward the ridge. She said, And what do you think now? I think, Rowan Ashcroft said slowly, that you were already asking me about my root cellar storage system before you even saw this. She looked at him. He looked at the valley. Come on, he said, and shook the reins, and the gelding started carefully down the slope toward home. The ranch road descended in long switchbacks, better maintained than the road above, with drainage cuts along the edges that someone had clearly put real thought into. Mabel noticed the engineering of it, not because she was looking for something to notice, but because she noticed things. The stream crossing at the valley floor had a solid wooden bridge, not a ford. The fence lines were straight and regularly posted. The barn doors were solid and closed against the wind. Someone had been thinking about this place for a long time. They crossed the bridge and came up to the house yard, where two men emerged from the barn and stood watching the wagon arrive. Both of them were looking at Mabel with the frank curiosity of men who had been told a woman was coming and had formed opinions about it that they were now revising in real time. One of them, young, maybe 22, with a weathered hat and a gap in his front teeth, said to Rowan, You make it up all right. Fine, Rowan said. The young man's eyes went back to Mabel, not unkindly, just openly. She had dealt with a lot of kinds of looking in her life. This was not the hostile kind. I'm Pete, the young man said to her. Pete Calloway. I do the horses and the upper pasture. Mabel Whitlock, she said. I do the kitchen and whatever else needs doing. Pete Calloway grinned, the full, uncalculated grin of a young man who had decided he liked someone. Good, he said. Rowan's cooking has been killing us slow. Pete, Rowan said. It's the truth, Pete said without particular apology, and led the horse to the hitching post while the other man, older and quieter, began unloading supplies from the wagon bed. Mabel climbed down from the bench. Her legs were stiff from 4 hours on that seat, and her back ached in the specific way of a person who has been bracing against jolts for an extended period. And the air up here was so cold, and so thin, and so clean, that it almost hurt to breathe. She stood in the yard of this enormous, impossible hidden ranch, and looked at the stone house in front of her and thought about what she had agreed to come to and what she had actually arrived at. They were not the same thing. But she had not come up here because it was exactly what she expected. She had come up here because the man's letters had been honest, and that was something she had found surprisingly hard to come by. Rowan came to stand beside her, not close, just near enough to speak. You can see the whole valley from the upper pasture, he said. But we can do that tomorrow. Tonight there's a room ready for you. First door on the left at the top of the stairs. She looked at the house. Does the stove work? Yes. What do you have in the kitchen right now? He looked like he was trying to remember. Beans, flour, salt pork, some potatoes. That's enough, she said. She picked up her satchel and walked to the front door of the house and went inside. The kitchen was the second room she found. She had to pass through a front entry with coat hooks and boot jacks, then a long main room with a stone fireplace that was cold and a table that needed cleaning. The kitchen was at the back, and it was large, which surprised her, and it had a cast iron range that was solid and serviceable and a window that looked out over the south meadow. It was also a disaster. Not dirty exactly, more like abandoned. Pots stored where they didn't belong, supplies in no logical order. A shelf of herbs above the range that hadn't been touched in so long, half of them had lost their smell. A heavy wooden table in the center of the room that was the right height but had never been properly cleaned, just wiped. Mabel set her satchel on a chair, put her coat on a hook near the door, rolled up her sleeves, and found wood stacked beside the range. She lit the stove. By the time Rowan came in from the yard, the kitchen was warm and smelled like something other than cold emptiness, and Mabel had sorted the stores enough to know what she had to work with, and there was a pot on the range that would be something worth eating within the hour. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. She did not look up from what she was doing. "You don't have to start tonight," he said. "The men need to eat," she said. "They've been eating." "Not well," she said, and she was not unkind about it, just factual. She found the salt and reached for it. "I'll need to know your full stores before the end of the week. If there are any gaps in what you've put up for winter, we need to know now while there's still time to get more." Rowan stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at this woman he had exchanged 7 letters with, who had arrived in his valley 4 hours ago, who was standing at his range, reorganizing his life with quiet, unhurried certainty, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll bring you the ledger after supper." "Good," she said. He went to wash up, and Mabel stirred the pot and listened to the sound of the wind moving across the high meadows outside, and she thought, for the first time in a long time, that she might have made the right decision. She was not sure about him yet. She was not sure about the Winters, or the 7 men she hadn't met, or the land speculators whose wagons she had seen tracks of on the upper road coming in. Fresh wheel ruts pointing away from the valley, which meant someone had been up here recently who was not Rowan. She was not sure about any of it, but the range was lit, and the pot was on, and outside the window the last light was going off the south meadow in a long, slow burn of orange and gold, and Mabel Whitlock was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where she intended to be. Pete Calloway knocked on the kitchen doorframe at 5:30 and said, a little hopefully, "Is that actual food?" "It will be in 20 minutes, Mabel said. He leaned against the frame with his hat in his hands. "Rowan tell you about the supply run we missed last month?" She looked up. "No. What supply run?" Pete shifted his weight. "Some fella came through about 6 weeks ago. Said he represented a land company out of Denver. Wanted to talk to Rowan about buying the valley." Rowan said no. 2 weeks later, our supply wagon from Coldwater never came. Teamster said he got a better contract. Rowan had to drive down himself, but by then some of the goods we ordered were already sold to someone else." He paused. Could have been coincidence. Mabel looked at the pot. She stirred it once, slowly, thinking. "Could have been," she said. Pete watched her. "You think it wasn't?" "I think," Mabel said carefully, "that a man who owns a hidden valley full of healthy grazing land would attract the kind of interest that doesn't give up after one no." Pete Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You've been here 4 hours." "I've been paying attention for 29 years, she said. He laughed, a real one, surprised out of him. He put his hat back on. "I'll tell the boys supper's almost ready." After he left, Mabel stood at the range in the gathering dark of the Colorado high country and thought about fresh wheel ruts on an access road and disrupted supply lines, and a man who wore patched clothes so the wrong people wouldn't know what he had, and whether 7 letters were enough to understand what she had walked into. She decided to find out. She stirred the pot, and the kitchen filled with warmth, and outside the window the first stars were appearing over the ridge. Where she had first seen this valley, she had not been told was hers to help protect. She hadn't been told a lot of things. She intended to learn them all. The ledger Rowan brought her after supper that first night was the kind of document that told a story without meaning to. Mabel sat at the kitchen table with it open in front of her, a candle at her left elbow. The remains of the meal cleared away, and she went through it page by page the way she had gone through things all her life. Slowly, without rushing to conclusions, letting the numbers tell her what they actually said rather than what she wanted them to say. What they said was complicated. The ranch was profitable. That much was clear even from a quick reading. The sheep operation alone was producing wool yields that most flatland operations would envy, and the cattle numbers, though smaller, were healthy. But the expense columns had a quality to it that she had seen before. Not in ranches, but in her mother's household accounts during the years when her father was sick and no one was watching where the money went. It was the quality of a capable person spending their energy on production and none of it on organization. Money going out in irregular amounts. Supply purchases that didn't track against consumption in any logical way. 3 separate entries for the same vendor in the same month at different prices, which meant someone was buying piecemeal instead of in bulk. which meant they were paying more than they had to, consistently, across years. She turned another page. Rowan was across the table from her, drinking coffee, and not pretending he wasn't watching her read. "Your feed costs are too high," she said, without looking up. "The elevation makes it expensive," he said. "The elevation is one factor," she said. "Buying from 3 different suppliers instead of 1 is another. You're not getting any volume discount and you're paying 2 sets of freight." Silence. "And your root cellar," she said, turning another page. "Your vegetable stores from last summer. What happened to them?" "Rotted out by February," he said flatly. "Too much moisture in the cellar walls. We had to make an emergency supply run." "In February? Down that road?" "Yes." She looked up at him. "That could have killed someone." "It almost did," he said. "Pete drove it. Took him 3 days what should have taken 1 because of the drifts." She looked back at the ledger. She turned 2 more pages and stopped. "Who is Halverson and Crane?" she asked. The quality of Rowan's silence changed. She noticed it before he spoke. A particular stillness, the kind that comes when a question has landed on something a person was not quite ready to discuss. "Land company," he said. "Out of Denver. They're listed here as having sent you 3 letters of inquiry." She looked at the entries. "In June, July, and August." "That's the company that sent the man Pete mentioned?" "Pete told you about that." "Pete told me part of it," she said. "These entries tell me the rest. They've been pursuing this for at least 4 months." She set her finger on the page. "And this entry here, September 14th. That's 3 weeks ago. What's this payment to a surveying company for?" Rowan put his coffee cup down. "I had my own survey done. Wanted the boundaries recorded properly, before anyone tried to claim otherwise." "Smart," she said. "Expensive," he said. "Also smart," she said. She closed the ledger and folded her hands on top of it and looked at him directly. "I want to understand the full situation. Not the version you think I need to hear. The actual version." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pushed back slightly in his chair, the way a man does when he is deciding how much to say, and said, "Halverson and Crane have been buying up mountain land across 3 counties. Most of it they get by waiting until a rough winter breaks a man and then offering him a price that's below value, but better than nothing." He paused. "They've had their eye on this valley for 2 years. My neighbor to the west, a man named Dupree, sold to them last spring after his 3rd hard year." "Is Dupree's land adjacent to yours?" "Shares the North Ridge," Rowan said. Mabel thought about that. "So they now own the land above your northern boundary?" "Yes. And the supply disruption Pete mentioned, the teamster who suddenly got a better contract." Rowan's jaw tightened slightly. "I can't prove it." "You don't need to prove it tonight," Mabel said. "You just need to understand what's happening so you can prepare for it." She opened the ledger again to the supply pages. "How long before the pass closes for winter?" 6 weeks? Maybe 7 if we're lucky with the weather. Then we have 6 weeks to fix every weakness in this ranch's preparation that they might be counting on breaking you with." She looked at the vegetable columns again, starting with the root cellar. Rowan was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with that expression she had caught once or twice on the drive up. Not quite surprised, something more considered than that. "You got here this afternoon," he said. "I got here this afternoon," she agreed, "and I've been paying attention since I sat down on your wagon." He picked up his coffee. "What do you need from me?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I want to see the whole ranch, everything. Not the version you show visitors, the real condition of it." She paused. "And I want to talk to your men." "They're rough company," he said. "I've handled rough company," she said. "I sat in Gerald Fitch's lobby for 2 hours." That almost smile appeared again. "Fair point," he said. She closed the ledger and stood up. Her back was aching from the day's travel, and she needed sleep more than she had admitted to herself. But she kept that information off her face because there were things more important than comfort right now, and one of them was making sure this man understood that she was not here to be managed. "One more thing," she said. "All right. Whatever Halverson and Crane have planned for this winter," she said, "I want you to remember that they are counting on you being alone. They have always been counting on you being alone." She picked up the candle. "You're not anymore." She went upstairs, and behind her she heard Rowan Ashcroft sit in the kitchen for a long time without moving. The room he had prepared for her was small and cold, and had a window that rattled in the wind, and the mattress was serviceable but not generous, and there was a hook on the wall that someone had put at exactly the wrong height for a woman of her build. And she fixed that assessment in her mind for later, and lay down in her coat for warmth until the room temperature climbed enough to sleep in. She was asleep within 10 minutes. She had always been able to do that, set herself down like a lamp being turned off, because a person who spent energy the way she spent it learned early that rest was not a luxury. She woke before dawn to the sound of the ranch coming to life outside. Boots on packed earth, the low conversation of men getting to work, the particular hollow complaint of a barn door being slid open on cold hinges. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself to the altitude, which made itself known in the slight heaviness behind her eyes, and the way her lungs felt like they were working a little harder than usual. Then she got up, dressed, went downstairs, and lit the range. By the time Pete Calloway and two other men she hadn't met yet came through the kitchen door at 6:30, there was oatmeal on the range and bacon and the kind of coffee that was actually hot and strong instead of merely warm and brown, and the kitchen smelled like a place where someone had decided things mattered. Pete stopped just inside the door and looked at the table and then at Mabel and said, "I think I'm going to like this arrangement." The man behind him was older, late 40s, thick through the chest, with a beard that had gone mostly white and a way of moving that suggested a bad knee on the left side. He looked at the table, then at Mabel, and said, "I'm Walt. I run the sheep operation." He said it without preamble, the way people introduce themselves when they consider name and function to be the same thing. "Walt," she said, "how many head?" 412, he said, and sat down. "As of this morning. Lost one to something last week. Don't know what yet." "I'll want to see the flock this week," she said, setting a bowl in front of him. "Not because I know sheep. I don't, not well, but because I want to understand everything that feeds into winter preparation." Walt looked at her for a moment. He had the cautious quality of a man who had formed opinions before arriving and was now unsure what to do with them. He said, "Rowan said you were a seamstress." "I am," she said. "I'm also whatever else is needed." He considered that. Then he picked up his spoon. The third man was young, younger than Pete, maybe 19, and introduced himself as Danny in a voice that was still finding its adult register. He ate quickly and didn't say much, and kept looking at Mabel with the specific uncertainty of a young person who hasn't yet decided whether a new presence in their world is a threat or not. Rowan came in last, when the others were halfway through eating, and sat at the head of the table without ceremony. He looked at the food and at Mabel and said, "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," she said. He looked at Walt. "After breakfast, I'm taking Miss Whitlock around the full property. You'll come for the grazing sections." Walt nodded without surprise, which told Mabel that Rowan had spoken to his men before she came downstairs. She appreciated that. It meant he was already thinking about how to integrate her arrival instead of just reacting to it. The tour took 4 hours. It was not a comfortable 4 hours. The temperature was in the low 30s, and the wind came off the north ridge in gusts that found every gap in a coat, and the terrain between the various parts of the ranch was rougher on foot than it had looked from the wagon the previous evening. Rowan walked it at a pace that was not punishing but was not leisurely either, and Mabel kept up without comment because she had not come up this mountain to be accommodated. What she saw on that walk expanded her understanding of the place significantly. The barn was large and solid, stone foundation, timber frame, well-maintained, with organized stalls and a hayloft that was already 3/4 full for winter. Good. The horse pen held 7 animals, all in reasonable condition. 2 of the outbuildings were equipment storage. One was a smokehouse that hadn't been used in at least 2 seasons, and one was the root cellar Rowan had mentioned. She stood in the root cellar doorway for a long time. It was, as she had guessed from the ledger, the weak point of the whole operation. Built into a hillside, which was correct, but the drainage around it was inadequate, and she could feel the moisture in the air the moment she stepped inside. The walls were sweating faintly even in late September. By February, with warm, cold cycles, everything stored in here would be in trouble. "How much did you lose to spoilage last winter?" she asked. Rowan, standing just outside, said, "Probably 1/3 of the vegetables." Some of the cured meat went soft. A third. She did the math against what she had seen in the ledger. At these supply costs, that was a substantial loss, and more than that, it was a vulnerability. A winter where the pass was closed and a third of your food supply was compromised was not a problem. It was a crisis. The drainage around this structure has to be regraded before the ground freezes, she said, and we need to build a secondary cold pantry off the kitchen. Smaller, better insulated, accessed without going outside, for daily use through the deep winter months. Rowan was quiet. I know that's a significant amount of work for 6 weeks, she said. I'm telling you it's necessary. I heard you, he said. I'm not arguing. I'm figuring out the labor. She stepped out of the cellar and pulled the door closed behind her. Pete can do the carpentry if he has the skill. The drainage regrading needs 2 men with shovels and 2 weeks of dry weather. She looked at the sky, which was clear and cold and would probably cooperate. We have the dry weather if we start immediately. Rowan looked at her. He had a look she was beginning to recognize. Not skepticism, not resistance, but the particular expression of a man recalibrating in real time, trying to catch up to a pace he had not set himself. You came up here to run a household, he said. I came up here to make this place work, she said. There's a difference. They walked the grazing sections with Walt in the afternoon, and that was where she began to understand the scale of what Rowan actually had. The alpine meadows in this valley, sheltered from the worst weather by the surrounding ridgeline, stayed green later into the season than anything at lower elevations. The grass was rich and the water sources clean and multiple. Walt talked about the sheep with the particular pride of a man who genuinely loved his work, and Mabel listened carefully and asked questions that were, she could tell, not quite what Walt had expected from a seamstress from Illinois. Your grazing rotation, she said at one point, walking the fence line of the east meadow. You're moving them on a fixed schedule? Walt squinted at her. Every 2 weeks. That's too long a cycle this late in the season, she said. The grass doesn't recover fast enough at this elevation in cool weather. You're overgrazing the eastern sections and leaving the western ones underutilized. Walt stopped walking. Behind her, she heard Rowan make a small sound that might have been a cough. Walt said, slowly, How long, you say, you've been up here? Since yesterday evening, she said. But I watched your flock for about 20 minutes from the upper pasture this morning, and I can see the grass difference from here, she pointed. Look at the color shift along the eastern fence. You can see where the ground is stressed. Walt looked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Rowan, Where'd you find her? Springfield, Rowan said. Walt looked at Mabel for another moment and then said gruffly, I'll adjust the rotation. That evening, after the men had eaten and gone to the bunkhouse and the ranch had gone quiet under a sky that was absurdly full of stars at this altitude, Mabel sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote out what she had observed that day in organized columns. The structural issues, the supply vulnerabilities, the labor tasks and their sequence, the timeline against the closing of the pass. She was halfway through when she became aware that Rowan was in the doorway. You should sleep, he said. I'm almost done, she said. He came in and sat across from her and looked at the paper without touching it. She turned it so he could read it right side up. He read it for a long time. This is everything in one day, he said. These are the time-sensitive items, she said. There's more, but it can wait until spring. He looked up. You saw all of this today. I was looking for it, she said. That's different from seeing. He was quiet. He had his hands flat on the table on either side of the paper, and he was looking at her in the way that made her slightly uncomfortable because it was too direct and too unguarded for a man she had known for 36 hours. She said, Say what you're thinking. He said, I'm thinking I sent a letter to a correspondence agency 8 months ago because my foreman quit and my cook was gone and I needed practical help. And I was thinking I'd get someone who could keep a kitchen and not fall apart in winter. He paused. I was not thinking I'd get this. I'm still the practical help, she said. This is just what practical looks like when you're paying attention. He looked at the paper again, at the drainage column, at the cold pantry sketch she had made in the margin, at the supply list with quantity estimates against 7 men over 5 months. The money isn't a problem, he said, whatever needs doing. I want you to know that. Don't limit yourself because you think I can't afford it. I know you can afford it, she said. I read your ledger. Something passed across his face. Not quite amusement, more like the recognition of a person who has encountered someone as practical as himself and finds it disorienting in a way that is not entirely unpleasant. Get some sleep, she said. We start on the drainage tomorrow. He stood up. He picked up his coffee cup from where he'd set it, and then stood there for a moment, cup in hand, not quite leaving. Miss Whitlock, he said. Mabel, she said. He paused. Mabel. The name came out slightly carefully, like something he was testing. Thank you. For today. She looked up from the paper. You don't need to thank me for doing the work I came here to do. I know, he said. I'm thanking you for how you did it. He went out, and Mabel sat for a moment with her pen still in her hand, looking at the empty doorway. Then she went back to her list. The work of the next 2 weeks was not beautiful. It was cold and physical and relentless in the way that fall preparation on a mountain ranch is always relentless, because the window is short and the cost of failing to fill it is measured in months of hardship. The drainage regrading around the root cellar took Pete and Danny 8 days, hard digging in rocky ground that didn't want to cooperate, requiring 2 redesigns of the slope angle before the water flow worked the way Mabel had calculated it needed to. She stood over them with the patience of a woman who understood that getting something right was more important than getting it done, and neither Pete nor Danny complained, which she appreciated. The cold pantry off the kitchen was Pete's project, and he was, as she had suspected, a better carpenter than he let on. He built it into the kitchen's north wall with an exterior vent that could be opened or closed depending on outside temperature, small enough to access without losing heat from the main room, insulated with packed straw between the inner and outer walls. When it was finished and she tested it with a thermometer over 3 consecutive nights, the temperature held within 5 degrees of ideal across a 20-degree swing in outside air. That'll work, she told Pete. He grinned. First time anyone's tested my carpentry with a thermometer. First time it mattered that precisely, she said. She sent Rowan down to Coldwater twice in that 2-week stretch, with supply lists she had written out in full detail, quantities, priorities, alternates, if the primary items were unavailable. On the first trip, he came back with everything on the list. On the second trip, he came back with everything except a specific quantity of rendered lard, which the general store claimed to be short on. He told her this in the kitchen table, and she looked at the entry on the list, and then asked, without particular alarm, "Did they say why they were short?" "Suppliers didn't come through," he said. She looked up at him. He was already looking at her with the particular steadiness of a man who had arrived at the same thought she was arriving at. "Same suppliers as the teamster who got a better contract," she said. "Probably," he said. "Can you get it from anywhere else within reasonable distance?" "Hendricks, the man who runs a small operation at the base of the South Fork. He renders his own." "Go see him," she said. "Don't tell him what it's for. Just buy it." Rowan looked at her. "You think they're watching what I buy?" "I think," she said, "that if I were trying to starve a ranch out through a winter I couldn't break any other way, I would start by making certain specific supplies hard to find, and I would do it quietly before the snow came, so that by the time the snow came there was nothing to be done about it." He was quiet. "How much of your winter preparation is visible from below?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "If someone in Coldwater wanted to know whether you were well prepared for winter or struggling, how would they know?" He thought about it. "They'd ask the suppliers, or they'd ask the teamsters." "So right now," she said, "what story are your suppliers and teamsters telling about this ranch?" The question landed and stayed. Rowan sat back in his chair. He rubbed a hand across the back of his neck in a gesture she had come to recognize as his physical equivalent of thinking hard. "The emergency supply run Pete made in February," he said slowly. "The rot in the root cellar. The items we couldn't get last month." He paused. "From the outside, this ranch looks like it's been having trouble." "Yes," she said. "But it's not." "No," she said. "But they don't know that. And I think," she said carefully, "that we should be very precise about what they continue to know and what we keep to ourselves for now." She looked at the ledger, still open on the table. "How many people in Coldwater know what this ranch actually produces?" "Almost none," he said. "That was deliberate from the beginning. I never wanted—" He stopped. To attract the wrong kind of interest, she finished. Yes. Then we keep doing that, she said. We prepare everything we need quietly, through the right channels, and we let Halverson and Crane continue believing what they already believe. She paused. And when winter comes and they come back expecting to find a man who's been broken by cold and short supplies, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Rowan looked at her across the table. You've thought about this more than you've said. I think about things while I work, she said. I had a lot of time to think while Pete and Danny were digging drainage channels. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what else? She looked at the supply list. The families on the lower mountain, the homesteaders. Are any of them struggling? 3 or 4, from what I've heard. Bad season for the small operations. And Halverson and Crane, she said. Are they approaching any of them? Rowan's expression shifted. I don't know. I don't have much contact with the lower valley operations. You should, she said. Not because of Halverson and Crane, because they're your neighbors, and a neighbor who doesn't make it through winter is a gap in the wall. She folded the supply list and set it aside. The strongest position you can be in by spring is not just a well-prepared ranch. It's a well-prepared community that has reason to look out for each other. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, without drama. But Rowan sat with it for a moment, as though it had weight. My father, he said, never trusted neighbors. Said they'd take what they could. Some do, Mabel said, some don't. But men who are determined to take everything you have are less likely to succeed when the people around you know your name. He looked at her. Is that from Illinois? Or is that just you? Mostly just me, she said. 3 days later, Rowan went down the mountain and came back with Hendrix's lard and news that he'd stopped at 2 homesteads on the lower slope and had talked to the families there for the first time in 2 years. He reported this at supper, matter-of-factly, as if it were just an item from the supply run. But Mabel caught Pete and Walt exchanging a look across the table that told her Rowan making social calls was not a thing that happened regularly. After supper, Walt stayed behind while the others went out. He stood in the kitchen doorway while Mabel washed the pot from the stew and said, without preamble, he hasn't done that in a long time, gone and talked to people. She kept washing. He seems like a man who prefers his own company. He is, Walt said. Was worse after the last one left. She looked up. The last one? Walt shifted his weight onto his good leg. Woman came up 2 winters ago. Not mail order. Met her in town. She lasted 6 weeks, then said the isolation was killing her and went back down. He paused. Rowan didn't say much about it, but he closed up after that. Started wearing those patched coats on purpose, like he was daring people to underestimate him. Mabel turned back to the pot. I see, she said. I'm not telling you to feel sorry for him, Walt said. He doesn't want that. I know, she said. I'm not built for feeling sorry for people anyway. She set the pot on the drying rack. I'm built for figuring out what needs doing and doing it. Walt looked at her for a moment. He had that cautious quality she had noticed at the first breakfast, the quality of a man who had formed an expectation and was working through the experience of it being wrong. You're not what any of us thought you'd be, he said. I know, she said. I never am. He nodded once, slowly, and went out. Mabel stood in the kitchen after he left, listening to the wind finding the gaps in the north wall that she had already noted needed chinking before the deep cold arrived, and she thought about a woman who had left after 6 weeks because the isolation was too much, and she thought about a man who had responded to that by making himself look like less than he was, and she thought about how much damage a person could do to their own life by deciding in advance that they were going to be disappointed. She had done something like that herself once. She had stopped applying to correspondence agencies for 2 years after the third man had written back to retract his interest once he understood what she looked like. She had told herself it was practical. It had been defeat, dressed up as practicality. She understood Rowan Ashcroft better than he probably realized. That night the temperature dropped hard and fast, the first real warning of the season, and in the morning there was a skin of ice on the water trough and frost on the inside of Mabel's window, and she lay in bed for 3 minutes listening to the sound of the ranch waking up in the cold and thought about what still needed to be done before the pass closed. Then she got up, went downstairs, and lit the range. The smoke from the chimney went straight up into a sky that was blue and perfectly cold and enormous, and from somewhere in the valley below the house she could hear Walt counting his flock in the morning quiet, his voice carrying clear and thin across the frozen grass. 4 weeks left, maybe 5. She had a cold pantry, regraded drainage, a corrected grazing rotation, 2 new supplier relationships, and the beginning of something she could not quite name yet. A shift in the way the men on this ranch moved around her, talked around her, included her in the small daily accounting of what needed doing. Not warmly, not yet, not entirely, but differently than the first morning. It was enough. For now, it was enough. What she did not have yet was any certainty about what Halverson and Crane were planning, or when, or how directly they intended to move against a ranch that was proving more difficult to isolate than they had expected. She had a feeling she would not be waiting long to find out. She turned the range damper and went to start breakfast, and outside the window the frost was burning off the south meadow in the early sun, and the day was already beginning without waiting for anyone's permission. The man from Halverson and Crane arrived on a Tuesday, which Mabel noted because it was the same day she had scheduled the second drainage inspection and the delivery of the last supply run before the pass became unreliable. He came up the road in a hired buggy that was too light for mountain travel and too clean to belong to anyone who knew this terrain, and he arrived at the ranch yard at mid-morning when Rowan was out at the north fence line with Pete, and Mabel was in the kitchen rendering the last of Hendrick's lard into storage containers. She heard the buggy before she saw it. The sound of wheels on the frozen yard stones was different from the sound of the ranch wagon, lighter and faster, and she set down the ladle and wiped her hands and went to the kitchen window and looked out. The man who climbed down from the buggy was somewhere in his 40s, well-dressed for Denver but wrongly dressed for this altitude, with a coat that was more about appearance than warmth and boots that were going to be miserable by afternoon. He had the kind of face that had learned to look pleasant professionally, not genuinely pleasant, but arranged into pleasantness the way a shopfront arranges its window. He stood in the yard and looked at the stone house and the barn and the outbuildings with an expression that he probably thought was neutral, but was in fact the expression of someone confirming a calculation. Danny was crossing the yard with a bucket when the man called out to him. Mabel couldn't hear the words through the glass, but she saw Danny stop, look at the man, look toward the house, and then point. Toward the house. Toward her. She went back to the range, picked up the ladle, and kept working. When the knock came on the kitchen door, she said, without turning around, "It's open." The man came in and brought cold air with him and the faint smell of a city, coal smoke and hair pomade, something that didn't belong at this elevation. He stopped just inside the door and looked at her at the range and recalibrated slightly, the way men did when they arrived expecting to find one thing and found another. "I was hoping to speak with Mr. Ashcroft," he said. "He's on the fence line," she said. "He'll be back for midday dinner. You're welcome to wait." A brief pause. "And you are Mabel Ashcroft," she said. It was the first time she had used that name, and it came out steadier than she expected. They had married 3 weeks prior in a brief civil ceremony conducted by the county clerk on one of Rowan's supply runs, practical, witnessed by Pete and the clerk's assistant, without ceremony that either of them had wanted. She had not been thinking of the name until this moment. "I run the household." The man's expression went through a small reorganization. "Congratulations," he said, with the professional warmth. "I wasn't aware Mr. Ashcroft had married." "Not many people are," she said. "He's a private man." "Indeed." The man came a few steps further into the kitchen, which she noted without turning to look. "My name is Clifford Marsh. I represent Halverson and Crane Land Development out of Denver. We've had some previous correspondence with your husband." "I know who you are," she said. Another pause. Longer this time. "Then you know we've expressed interest in this property," Marsh said. "I was hoping to present a revised offer, considerably more generous than our previous communications." She turned around then. She did it unhurriedly, the way she did everything, and she looked at Clifford Marsh with the same direct attention she had given the ledger on her first night in this kitchen. He was, up close, exactly what she had expected from the outside. Not a bad man necessarily, a man who did a particular kind of work and had done it long enough that he'd stopped thinking about what it meant for the people on the other end of it. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "my husband's position on the sale of this property has not changed." "I understand that," he said, with the patient tone of a man who has heard objections before and has responses prepared. "But circumstances do change. Winter up here is—" "I'm aware of what winter up here is," she said. "I've spent the last month preparing for it." He looked around the kitchen, at the full cold pantry visible through its open door, at the organized stores on the shelves, at the general quality of a place that was clearly being managed carefully, and she saw the calculation happening behind his professional face. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes," she said. She turned back to the range. "I'll tell Rowan you came. If he wants to speak with you before you head back down, he'll come find you. If he doesn't come find you before noon, you'll have your answer." A pause that stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Marsh said, and his voice had shifted slightly. The professional warmth had thinned a little at the edges. "I want to be direct with you, the kind of winter this valley sees, the isolation, the supply difficulties, the physical demands on a woman who isn't—" He stopped. She kept her back to him and kept her voice completely level. "Who isn't what, Mr. Marsh?" The silence was its own answer. "I'd encourage you," he said finally, with the pleasantness back in place, "to consider your own well-being when you discuss this offer with your husband." "I'll do that," she said. "Close the door on your way out. We're losing heat." She heard him leave. She heard the kitchen door close. She heard, a few minutes later, the sound of his buggy moving out of the yard and down toward the lower road. Then she set down the ladle, gripped the edge of the range with both hands, and stood still for a moment, not because she was shaken, because she was angry, and she had learned a long time ago that acting from anger was less effective than acting from clarity, and she needed a moment to let the anger settle into something she could use. Who isn't what? She knew what word he had stopped himself from saying. She had heard it, or its cousins, her whole life, in the stops and recalibrations and careful pauses of people who thought physical size was a measure of what a person could endure. She picked up the ladle and finished the lard. When Rowan came in for midday dinner with Pete and Walt, she told him about Marsh in the same straightforward way she told him about supply deliveries and drainage results. She gave him the substance of the conversation without editorializing, and she watched his face go through something controlled and cold while she talked. When she finished, Pete said, "He came up here himself. They've never done that before." "They're escalating," Walt said. Rowan was looking at the table. "What did the offer number?" "He didn't give one," Mabel said. "He said considerably more generous. He was testing the room before committing to a figure." Rowan looked up at her. "And what did the room tell him?" "That the room is not for sale," she said. Rowan held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Pete. "I want to know if that buggy makes any stops on the lower road before it hits Coldwater. Can you ride ahead of it without being seen?" Pete was already pushing back his chair. "I can try." "Don't try," Rowan said. "Do it or don't." Pete thought for 2 seconds. "I'll do it." He left before he'd finished eating, which for Pete Calloway was an indication of seriousness. What Pete came back with, 4 hours later, was information that changed the temperature of everything. Marsh's buggy had stopped at 2 homesteads on the lower mountain, the Greer place and the Lundqvist claim. Both families had been struggling. The Greers had lost most of their summer crop to an early frost. The Lundqvists had a sick horse that had cost them a season's worth of work. Pete had not been able to hear the conversations, but he had seen Marsh spend 40 minutes at each property, and he had seen both families standing in their yards watching the buggy leave with expressions that Pete described, with unusual precision for someone his age, as the way people look when they've been told something they want to believe and aren't sure yet if they should. Mabel sat with that for a long evening. After supper, she went to Rowan in the front room where he was going through the survey documents he'd had prepared, and she sat across from him and said, "The Greers and the Lundqvists, how bad is their situation?" He set the papers down. "Greer's been on that claim for 7 years, built it himself. He'd hate to lose it." "Would he sell to Halverson and Crane if they made it look like his only option?" Rowan was quiet. "I don't know him well enough to answer that." "Could you go talk to him before Marsh gets back to Coldwater and files whatever he's going to file?" "About what?" About the winter, she said. About whether he's put up enough supplies. About whether he needs anything. She paused. Not charity, neighborly conversation. Rowan looked at her. You think if he has a reason to feel connected to this valley, he's less likely to sell to the men trying to pick it apart? I think, she said, that people make desperate decisions when they feel alone. And I think Halverson and Crane know that, which is why they work the way they work. She folded her hands. You have what the Greers need. Not money. Resources. Preserved food, extra labor for a day, access to the connections you've built with suppliers. If you offer that to your neighbors before Halverson and Crane get back to them with a contract, you change what those families are choosing between. Rowan was quiet for a long time. The fire in the front room had burned down to a deep orange, and the wind outside was picking up, finding the north wall the way it did every evening now. My father's voice in my head, he said finally, is telling me that getting involved in other people's troubles is how you get pulled into them. Your father, Mabel said carefully, built a ranch that no one knew existed and lived in it alone for 20 years. The words came out before she had fully decided to say them. She held his gaze and didn't take them back. He looked at her. There was a moment where she genuinely did not know which direction it would go. Whether he would close down the way Walt had told her he could close down, or whether he would stay with it. He stayed with it. That's fair, he said quietly. I'm not criticizing him, she said. I'm saying the strategy that built this ranch is not the same strategy that will protect it. He nodded, slowly. I'll go see Greer tomorrow. She went back to the kitchen. She heard him sit with the fire for another hour before he went to bed. Rowan rode to the Greer place the next morning and came back in the afternoon with a look on his face that was difficult to read. He found Mabel in the yard directing Danny on the last of the fence reinforcements along the south pasture, and he waited until Danny had moved off before he said anything. Marsh was back, he said. Went to the Greers this morning before I got there. Left them a written offer. She looked at him. How much? Enough to clear their debt and have something left. Not what the land is worth, but enough to look reasonable to a family that's scared. Did Greer sign it? No, his wife wouldn't let him until he'd slept on it. He paused. She's the smarter of the two, from what I can see. Did you talk to them? For 2 hours, he said. Told them what I knew about Halverson and Crane's pattern. Told them about Dupree. He stopped. Greer didn't know Dupree had sold. He thought Dupree had just moved on. Of course he didn't know, Mabel said. That's how they work. Every family feels like they're making their decision in isolation. I told him that, Rowan said. I also told him that if he needs extra hands for the winter, he can borrow Pete 2 days a week through February, and I'll extend him credit at my suppliers for whatever he's short on. He said it with the slight discomfort of a man who has done something unfamiliar. He didn't say much when I offered. His wife cried. Mabel looked at the fence line for a moment. That's good, she said. It felt strange, he said. I don't usually... I know, she said. Keep doing it anyway. What she did not tell him, not yet, because the thought was still forming, was that a single conversation with the Greers was not enough. Halverson and Crane were not working one family at a time out of inefficiency. They were working multiple pressure points simultaneously, and the pattern she had seen in Rowan's ledger and in Marsh's visit and in the 2 stops on the lower road was the pattern of an operation that had done this before and had refined it. They would come back before the pass closed. She was certain of it, and when they came back, they would not come with just an offer. They would come with something that looked like inevitability. She needed the valley to not be isolatable when that happened. The storm that changed everything arrived 11 days later without adequate warning. The sky had been building wrong for 2 days, a particular gray-green color at the edges that Walt said he'd seen before and didn't like. But the temperature had been holding and the barometric pressure hadn't dropped with the urgency that usually preceded a serious storm. And so they had continued working, continued preparing, continued the careful accumulation of readiness that Mabel had been orchestrating since her first week. She was in the root cellar doing a final inventory when the wind shifted. She felt it before she heard it, a pressure change, something physical in the air. the way a room feels different when someone large walks in. She came out of the cellar and looked at the sky and saw that the gray-green had moved to directly overhead, and the light had gone wrong, flat and strange, and the temperature had dropped 4 degrees in the time it had taken her to count the preserved vegetable stores. She walked to the barn and said to Walt, who was inside with 2 of his men, "Close everything and get everyone in." Walt looked at her. "Now," she said. Not loud, but something in the way she said it moved him immediately, which surprised her slightly. She went to the house and found Danny and sent him for Pete, and then went to the kitchen and began filling every available container with water before the outside pump had any chance of freezing, because that was always the first thing people forgot, and it was always the thing that mattered. Rowan came in from the upper pasture 20 minutes later, moving fast, and took one look at the kitchen and said, "You already started." "Half an hour ago," she said. "How bad does it look from up there?" "Bad," he said. "Coming from the northwest. That ridge funnels it." "The sheep?" "Walt's got them into the east barn. Cattle are in the lower shelter." He was pulling off his coat. "Pete's securing the equipment shed." "The Greers," she said. He stopped. "They're not prepared for a serious storm," she said. "They told you they were short on firewood." "I can't get to them now," he said. "If this is what I think it is, the lower road will be impassable in 2 hours." "I know," she said. "I'm not saying go. I'm saying remember them when it's over." He held her gaze. "All right." The storm arrived in full within the hour, and it was, as Rowan had indicated, and as she had calculated from the sky and the wind shift and 29 years of paying attention to what the natural world told you when you were willing to listen, genuinely serious. Not the worst storm she would ever see in these mountains, she suspected, but enough. Snow horizontal in the gusts, visibility at the yard fence and no further, temperature dropping hard and fast toward a number that made the cold pantry's insulation not a comfort, but a necessity. They lost 2 days. During those 2 days, Mabel did not stop moving. She kept the range burning at the right temperature for the stored food, without overheating the kitchen. She managed the water supply she had filled in the last hour before the pump froze. She organized the men's time inside the house when they couldn't work outside. She cooked 3 times a day without waste, and with the exact precision of someone who was watching stores and calculating duration simultaneously. Walt came in on the second day with ice in his beard and sat down heavily at the kitchen table and said, "Lost 3 sheep." She set a bowl of hot food in front of him without comment. He ate for a while in silence and then said, "Could have been worse." "Yes," she said. "You had us ready," he said. It was not exactly gratitude. It was more like a man updating a record, setting something down in the right column. "The drainage work kept the root cellar dry," she said. "That's what you're eating right now. Those potatoes would be gone without it." He looked down at the bowl. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When Rowan told us a mail-order bride was coming, I thought—" He stopped. "I know what you thought," she said. "You probably do," he said. "I was wrong." She looked at him. Walt was not a man who said things like that easily. She could see it cost him something small to say it, and she respected the cost. "Eat your food," she said. "It's getting cold." He ate. On the 3rd day, the storm broke and the sky came back cold and clear, and the valley was buried under 18 inches of new snow, which was not catastrophic for this elevation, but was enough to make the lower road a serious undertaking for several days. Rowan went out with Pete and Danny to assess, and came back with a list of tasks that would take most of the week to address. Clearing access to the stock shelters, checking the weight on the barn roof, digging out the equipment they would need to dig out everything else. In the middle of all of this, a rider came up the valley road from the south. Mabel saw him from the kitchen window, a single figure on horseback, moving slowly because the road was drifted in places, coming from the direction of the lower homesteads. She went out to the yard to meet him because Rowan was on the barn roof and she wasn't going to shout. The rider was Greer's oldest son, maybe 16, with a frost-reddened face and the specific look of a young person who had been sent somewhere they weren't sure about. He pulled up in the yard and said, "You're the Ashcroft place?" "Yes," she said. "What happened?" "My father sent me," the boy said. "The storm took out our south wall. We lost most of what was in the lean-to storage." He was trying to be composed about it, He said to ask Mr. Ashcroft if there was anything to spare. He said he'd pay it back in spring. Mabel looked at the boy. He was doing well at not showing how frightened he was, which meant he had probably been doing that for the duration of the storm. "Get down and warm up," she said. "I'll get Mr. Ashcroft." She went to the barn and called up to Rowan on the roof. He came down immediately. She told him in 12 words what the situation was. He was walking to the yard before she'd finished. What followed was not graceful. It was practical and fast and slightly chaotic, which was how emergency sharing of resources usually worked. Rowan and Pete loading a supply sledge while Mabel organized what could be spared without compromising their own stores, which required 10 minutes of rapid mental calculation that she did at the cold pantry door with the inventory list she had been keeping in her head since the storm started. She could spare potatoes, preserved carrots, dried beans, 2 sides of cured pork, and a quantity of firewood from the secondary stack without putting the ranch at risk. She was precise about this and said so when Rowan looked like he was going to load more. "That's the line," she said. He looked at what was already on the sledge. "That's enough for them," she said, "and it leaves us where we need to be." He accepted that. She had come to understand that Rowan accepted precise reasoning even when the conclusion was not what he would have chosen, because precise reasoning was the language he trusted. The Greer boy went back with the sledge and Pete, and Rowan watched them go and then stood in the yard for a moment in the cold. "The Lundqvists," he said. "Check on them as soon as the road allows," she said. "Tomorrow, if you can." He turned and looked at her. He was standing in the snowy yard with his coat open because he'd come off the barn roof in a hurry, and there was sawdust in his hair from the repair work and a cut on the back of his left hand that he hadn't mentioned, and he was looking at her with the expression she had seen a few times now, the one that was past recalibration and into something she didn't have a clean word for yet. "You know," he said, "when I wrote that letter to the agency, I put down that I needed someone practical." "I remember," she said. "You said so in your first letter." "I thought I meant someone who could manage a kitchen and not go to pieces in February." She waited. "I didn't think I meant someone who would run the whole operation while I was on the barn roof," he said. She looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. The word came out flat and certain. "It's the opposite of a complaint." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Your hand is bleeding. Come inside." He looked at his hand as if he'd forgotten about it. "It's nothing. It's a cut that needs cleaning before infection sets in, which would be a stupid problem to have right now," she said. "Come inside." He came inside. She cleaned the cut at the kitchen table with the methodical care she applied to everything, and he sat still and let her and did not make the noises that men usually made when someone touched a wound. He just watched her work with the same direct attention he gave to everything, and she kept her eyes on what she was doing because his watching had a quality that made her want to look up, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. "The Greers won't sell now," he said, while she wrapped the hand. "No," she said, "because we gave them a reason not to." "Because we gave them a reason to feel like they have something here worth keeping," she said. "That's different." He was quiet. "When Marsh comes back," she said, tying off the bandage, "he's going to find this valley harder to pressure than he expected. But he will come back. Men like that don't stop because they hit resistance once." "What do you think he'll do?" She smoothed the bandage and sat back. "I think he'll try to interrupt something we need. He already tried the supply lines. The storm gave him cover for the first round of disruption. He'll use it if he can, claim the road damage, the supply shortages, anything that looks like natural difficulty." She looked at Rowan. "But the thing he's going to try that worries me most isn't the supplies." Rowan waited. "He's going to try to tell a story," she said, "about this ranch, about us. He's going to go back to Coldwater and tell people that this winter is breaking us, that the storm hit us hard, that the operation is struggling, that the woman who came up here was a liability and not an asset." She paused. "Because the most dangerous thing Halverson and Crane can do to you is make the people around you believe you're already failing before you actually fail." Rowan looked at her steadily. "So what do we do about that?" he said. She had been thinking about this since the morning of the storm. She had been building it in pieces, the way she built everything, and it was almost complete now. "We invite people here," she said. "The Greers, the Lundqvists, any other family on the lower mountain that Halverson and Crane has been circling. We bring them up here and they see for themselves what this valley actually looks like after the storm. Healthy animals, full stores, a functioning operation. She folded her hands on the table. And we do it before Marsh gets a chance to tell his version. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. "You want to open the ranch," he said. The words came out with the particular weight of someone who understood exactly what that meant against the background of his entire adult life. The hidden valley, the patched coat, 20 years of deliberate invisibility. "I want to make the truth louder than the lie," she said. "Yes." The fire in the range clicked and settled. Outside the kitchen window, the valley was buried in white and impossibly beautiful in the way that destroyed places sometimes were. Rowan sat with it. "All right," he said finally. It came out quiet, but it came out without hesitation. She nodded and stood up to start supper, and behind her Rowan sat at the table in his own kitchen in the middle of his hidden valley and looked at his bandaged hand, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself, and she let him. 3 days later, the first family came up the mountain. It was not what any of them had planned exactly. The Greer boy arrived again, this time with his father and his father's neighbor, a man named Pollard, whose fence line had collapsed under the snow weight and who had lost 2 cattle to something that looked like it might be the same predator Walt had been tracking since October. They came ostensibly to return the borrowed sledge and to ask about the cattle problem. They ended up staying for the midday meal, and during that meal, sitting at the long kitchen table with Rowan and Walt and Pete, Greer looked around the kitchen and the adjacent cold pantry and the organized stores and the general quality of a ranch that had come through the storm in better shape than he had, and he said, to no one in particular, "I was thinking about taking that offer." Everyone at the table went quiet. Greer looked at his hands. "Before the storm, I was thinking about it." Rowan said nothing. Greer said, "That man Marsh came to see us 3 times. He kept saying how hard the winters were going to be, how a man alone couldn't manage it, how the sensible thing was to take the money while it was on the table." Pete said, "He came here too." Greer looked up. "What did you tell him?" Rowan looked at Mabel. She was at the range with her back to the table, and she didn't turn around, but she was listening to every word. Rowan said, "We told him no." Greer looked at the table. He was a lean, weather-worked man in his 40s with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a long time without being sure they were winning. He said, "How do you manage it? The isolation, the winters, all of it?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then, in the measured way he had of saying things that cost him something to say, he said, "I had help. I didn't know I needed it until it arrived." Mabel kept her back to the table. She adjusted the pot on the range that didn't need adjusting. The fire cracked once in the stove belly and settled. Greer looked at his neighbor Pollard, and Pollard looked at his hands, and then Greer said quietly, "Marsh is going to be back." "Yes," Rowan said, "and he's going to bring a contract." "Probably, and if enough of us sign, he gets the land access he wants, and the valley loses its water rights within 2 seasons, Rowan said. "I've talked to a lawyer in Denver. That's how they've done it in 2 other counties." The table was quiet. Mabel turned around. She looked at Greer and Pollard and said, "You don't have to decide anything today. But before you decide anything, you should know what this valley actually is. Come and see it when the snow clears a bit. Bring your families." She paused. "And bring anyone else on the lower mountain who's had a visit from Marsh." Greer looked at her. He had done this every time she spoke. Looked at her with a slight recalibration, as if he kept forgetting between sentences that she was the one who'd organized the supply sledge that had kept his family eating through the storm. "All right," he said. Pollard nodded. Outside, the snow was brilliant and hard-edged in the afternoon sun, and somewhere on the far side of the valley, Walt was counting his flock in the cold, and the mountain was quiet in the particular way it was quiet after a serious storm, like something that had made its point and was now waiting to see what you did with it. Mabel went back to the range. She had 6 weeks left before deep winter locked them in completely. Maybe less. What she had right now was a ranch that had survived its first test, 2 families who had not signed a contract, and the beginning of something that was still too fragile to name. It was not enough. Not yet. But the storm had come and they were still standing, and in her experience, that was always the first thing that needed to be true before anything else could be. The families came up the mountain on a Saturday, 12 days after the first storm, during a break in the weather that felt borrowed rather than earned. Mabel had been watching the sky since Thursday. The window was real but narrow. 2 days, maybe 3, before the next system moved in from the northwest, and she had told Rowan this on Friday morning with the same directness she brought to everything, and he had ridden down to the Greer place that afternoon and sent word to Pollard and to 2 other families whose names had come up in the conversation at the kitchen table. 4 families arrived. The Greers came first, all 6 of them, including the grandmother who had to be helped off the wagon, but who looked at the valley below the ridge with an expression that made Mabel think she had seen difficult country before and knew what it meant that this place was still standing clean and organized after a serious storm. The Pollards came behind them, then a family named Schreiber that Mabel hadn't met, husband and wife and 3 children, the youngest maybe 4 years old and thoroughly unimpressed by the elevation. Last came a single man, older, who introduced himself as August Holt and said he ran a small timber operation on the south slope and had been visited by Marsh twice in the past month. They stood in the yard in the cold morning sun, these 12 people plus the ranch crew, and there was a moment of the particular social awkwardness that happens when people who don't know each other well find themselves gathered for a purpose that hasn't been stated plainly yet. Rowan handled it badly, which did not surprise Mabel. He was a man who ran his operation through direct instruction and trusted relationships built over years, not through the management of a group of uncertain strangers in his own yard. He stood at the front of the gathering with his hands in his coat pockets and said something about being glad people had come. And it came out stiffer than he meant it to, and she could see the Schreiber husband glancing at his wife with a look that said, "Why are we here exactly?" Mabel was standing to the side near the kitchen door because she had not thought it was her place to stand at the front. She reconsidered that. She walked to where Rowan was standing and stood beside him and said, clearly enough for everyone to hear, "Thank you all for making the trip up. The road's not easy after snow, and we know it costs you a day. We thought it was worth your time to see what this valley looks like after a hard storm, so you have something real to compare against whatever you've been told about it." A beat of silence. Then Greer said from the middle of the group, "We've been told it's struggling." "I know," Mabel said. "That's why we invited you." She took them through the barn first because the barn was the clearest evidence. Healthy animals, organized, the hayloft well-stocked, nothing that looked like a ranch on the edge of failure. Walt walked them through the sheep operation with the pride of a man who genuinely loved his work and knew it was good, and the Schreiber husband, who ran a small sheep operation of his own, started asking Walt questions that turned into a 20-minute conversation about grazing rotation that Mabel listened to with half her attention while she watched the rest of the group. August Holt was the one she watched most carefully. He moved through the barn and the outbuildings with the slow attention of a man who was actually looking, not just being polite about it, and what he was looking for was structural. The quality of the building work, the soundness of the repairs, the evidence of whether this place had been maintained or merely patched. She had learned to recognize that kind of looking. It was the looking of someone who built things for a living and judged places by their bones. He caught her watching him at one point and said, without preamble, "Who built the cold pantry addition?" "Pete Calloway," she said. "One of our hands." Holt went and looked at the pantry through the kitchen door. She had left it open deliberately. He studied the framing for a moment. "Good work," he said. "Better insulation method than most." "He had clear instructions," she said. Holt looked at her. He was somewhere in his 60s, weathered and direct, with the economy of expression that came from decades of working alone in the woods. "You gave him the instructions?" "I worked out what was needed," she said. "He knew how to build it." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marsh told me this ranch was going to fold by February. Said the woman up here was a burden, not a help." Mabel looked at him steadily. "And what do you think now?" He looked around the kitchen, at the organized stores, at the full cold pantry, at the breakfast remains still being cleared by Danny, who was trying to be invisible in the corner. "I think Marsh is a careful liar," Holt said. "Those are the most dangerous kind." "Yes," she said. "They are." He went back outside, and Mabel finished clearing the table. and when she came out to the yard, the group had gathered near the south fence line, where Rowan was pointing out the valley's water sources and explaining the grazing territories. He was doing better now. Away from the formal gathering, talking about the land itself, he was in his element, and she could see the Schreiber husband listening with real interest, and Greer asking follow-up questions that meant he was actually thinking about what he was hearing. She stood at the edge of the group and listened and let him talk, because this was his valley, and he knew it better than anyone, and the best thing she could do in this moment was nothing. After the tour, she fed everyone. This was not a small undertaking for a kitchen built for 7 men and her, but she had planned for it since Wednesday, and the cold pantry and the main stores held what she needed. She made the kind of food that was honest and filling and warm without being showy about it. A large pot of stew with good bread, dried apple preserves that she had put up in October, coffee that was actually hot. She set the table in 2 sittings because the kitchen couldn't hold everyone at once, and she moved between the range and the table with the efficiency of a woman who had been calculating quantities and timing since before anyone else was awake. The Greer grandmother sat at the second table and watched Mabel work and said, at one point, "You do this every day for 7 men?" "Every day," Mabel said. "And all the rest of it," the old woman said. It wasn't a question. "And all the rest of it," Mabel agreed. The grandmother looked at her with the frank appraisal of someone very old who has stopped being polite about looking. "You're not what my grandson described," she said. "What did he describe?" The old woman almost smiled. "He's 16. He described a large woman who gave orders." She picked up her coffee. "He left out the part where she clearly runs the place." Mabel said nothing to that and went back to the range. After the meal, when the children had been turned loose in the yard under Pete's reluctant supervision, and the adults had settled into the front room with their coffee, the conversation shifted into the thing it had been building toward all day. It happened naturally, the way those conversations do when the right people are in the right room. Greer mentioned Marsh's name, and Holt picked it up, and within 10 minutes, everyone was talking about what they had each been told, and when, and in what order. Mabel sat in the corner chair and listened and did not speak until she had the full picture. What emerged was more organized than she had suspected, and more disturbing. Marsh had visited every family in this room multiple times. He had told each of them, individually, that the others were already considering selling. He had told the Greers that the Schreibers were almost certainly going to sign by spring. He had told the Schreibers that the Greers were holding out only on price. He had told Holt that the ranch at the top of the mountain, Rowan's ranch, was struggling badly and would likely be foreclosed on by March. Each family had been made to feel that they were the last holdout in a situation that was already decided. The room was quiet when this finished being assembled. Outside, Pete's voice carried from the yard, apparently engaged in some game with the Schreiber children that he hadn't intended to get into, but couldn't figure out how to exit. Greer said slowly, "He lied to all of us." "About each other," Rowan said. He was sitting forward in his chair, elbows on his knees. "And about this ranch." "Why this ranch specifically?" Schreiber asked. "Because if you believed the anchor operation in this valley was failing," Mabel said from her corner, "you'd have no reason to think holding on was worth it." Everyone looked at her. "Halverson and Crane don't need every parcel," she said. "They need the water rights. The water in this valley runs through Rowan's land and through Holt's timber section and through the Greer property. If they can get those 3, the rest follows." She set down her coffee cup. "They've been working the smaller claims to isolate the larger ones, making each family feel alone so that the larger landholders feel unsupported and eventually unsustainable." Holt said, "How do you know this?" "I read Rowan's ledger on my first night here," she said. "The pattern of supply disruptions, the timing of Marsh's visits, the properties Halverson and Crane have already acquired in the area. I've been looking at it since October." The room was quiet again. Schreiber was looking at his wife, who was looking at Mabel. Greer said, "So what do we do?" Rowan looked at Mabel. She had not planned to be the one who answered this, but the room was looking at her, and she had the answer, and there was no practical reason to pretend otherwise. "First," she said, "we stop making decisions as if we're separate. Whatever Marsh tells any one of you about what the others are doing, you verify it with each other before you act on it. That's the simplest thing, and it cuts the main tool he's been using." Nods around the room. Second, she said, Rowan's lawyer in Denver needs to file a formal record of the water rights as they currently stand, with all the easements clearly documented, before spring when Halverson and Crane are likely to move on the legal side. That's been started, but it needs to be completed. Rowan said, We can have that done by February. Third, Mabel said, and she paused here because this was the one she was least certain about. Anyone who is in genuine financial difficulty, short on supplies, unable to make a loan payment, anything that might make an offer from Marsh look like relief, I want to know about it before you make any decision. Not because this ranch can solve everything, but because there are often options that look unavailable when you're standing inside the problem alone and look different when someone else is looking at it with you. Schreiber was looking at the floor. Mabel noticed this and filed it. Holt said, You're talking about this valley acting like a community. Yes, she said. Holt looked at Rowan. You've been up here 20 years without acting like anything of the kind. I know, Rowan said. He said it without defensiveness. I was wrong about that. Holt held his gaze for a moment. Then he said, All right. He said it the way he'd said everything, flat and final and meaning it. After the families left in the late afternoon, down the mountain in a loose convoy, the Schreiber children asleep in the wagon before they'd cleared the first switchback, Rowan stood in the yard and watched them go, and then stood there after they were out of sight. Mabel came out after a few minutes with 2 cups of coffee, which was not something she had done before. She handed him one without comment and stood beside him in the cold. He said, 20 years. She didn't say anything. 20 years I kept this place secret because I thought that was the only way to protect it, he said. And one land company figured out what it was worth anyway, and they've been working to take it for 2 years, and all my secrecy did was make sure I had no one to stand with when they came. She drank her coffee. The sun was low and the valley was going gold and cold. You have people now, she said. He looked at her. Because you went and found them. You went and found them, she said. I just pointed the direction. He shook his head slightly, not disagreeing, just the gesture of a man setting something aside for later. Schreiber, he said. He's in trouble. She had noticed the same thing. Yes. Loan? Probably. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes when I talked about financial difficulty. I'll ride to him next week, Rowan said, before Marsh gets there first. Good, she said. They stood there a little longer in the cold. Pete came out of the barn and stopped when he saw them standing together and then very deliberately went back into the barn without saying anything, which Mabel appreciated. Can I ask you something? Rowan said. Yes. In Springfield, he said, before you came here, was there... He stopped, recalibrated. Why did you answer the letter? The honest reason. She looked at the valley. It was a fair question, and he had earned a fair answer. I had spent 6 years being practical about my situation, she said. I knew what I looked like, and I knew what that meant in the marriage market, and I had made peace with most of it. But practical and content aren't the same thing. She paused. Your letter was the first one that didn't promise me anything except work and truth. And I thought, a man who writes that, who doesn't dress it up, might be a man who's actually capable of seeing what's in front of him instead of what he expected to see. Rowan was quiet. Was I wrong? She said. No, he said. The word came out the way his important words always did, without decoration. She went inside to start supper. December arrived with the particular indifference of mountain winters, which did not care whether you were ready or not, and expressed this by sending a second serious storm the first week of the month, followed by a cold snap that dropped the temperature low enough to freeze the secondary water barrel in the barn overnight. The ranch held, not perfectly. The freeze cracked a section of the south fence that took 3 days to repair in conditions that made the work miserable, and they lost a steer to a predator that left tracks Walt couldn't identify, and the road to the lower mountain became impassable for 10 days that stretched everyone's nerves because impassable meant cut off. And cut off in December with Halverson and Crane circling was a different feeling than cut off in a normal year. But the stores held, the animals were healthy, the cold pantry performed exactly as designed, And the 7 men on the ranch ate well enough that Pete told her one evening, with complete sincerity, that he had never been better fed in his life, which was a sentence that made Danny look up from his plate and nod with the absolute conviction of the very young. What the 10 days of isolation could not contain was information, and what arrived when the road cleared was not good. Pete came back from his first ride to the lower valley with 2 pieces of news. The first was that Schreiber had received a second visit from Marsh during the closed road period, and this time Marsh had brought a contract and a partner, a man Pete had not seen before, and the visit had lasted several hours. The second piece of news was what this partner had said to the Schreiber family, which Pete reported at the kitchen table that evening with the careful precision of someone who understood that the exact words mattered. The partner, Pete said he was younger than Marsh, city clothes, had the manner of a lawyer or someone who wanted to be mistaken for one, had told Schreiber that the Ashcroft Ranch had been under review by the county land office for a documentation irregularity in the original title, and that if the irregularity was found to be material, the property could revert to the territory and any water rights agreements built on that title would be void. Rowan went very still when Pete finished. Walt said, "What irregularity?" "There isn't one," Rowan said. "The survey I had done in September was specifically to prevent this kind of claim." "Can they make it stick?" Mabel asked. "No," Rowan said, "but they don't need to make it stick. They need to make Schreiber believe it long enough to sign." He pushed back from the table. "I need to wire my lawyer." "The road to Coldwater is open now," Pete said. "Barely, but open." Rowan was already standing. "Wait," Mabel said. He looked at her. "If you ride to Coldwater to wire your lawyer, Marsh's people will know it," she said. "They have someone watching the telegraph office. I'd bet on it. The moment they know you're lawyering up in a hurry, they'll move faster on Schreiber." Rowan stood at the head of the table. "Then what?" he said. "Go to Schreiber first," she said, "today, before the wire. Tell him what this claim actually is and what your documentation says. Let him see the survey papers." She looked at Rowan steadily. "He needs to hear the truth from you before he finishes believing their version. Then wire the lawyer, but frame it as a routine update, not a crisis response." "You think they're watching the telegraph office?" Rowan said. "I think they've thought about this longer than we have, and they are not careless," she said. "So we should not be either." A pause. Then Pete said, quietly, "She's right." Rowan looked at Pete, then at Mabel. He picked up his coat. "I'll go to Schreiber now. I'll take the survey documents." He paused. "Come with me." She looked up. "You explain it better than I do," he said. "Schreiber's wife is the one who makes the decisions in that house. You saw it today. She's the one listening." Mabel had seen it. She looked at the stove and calculated what could be left and for how long, and at what temperature, and then looked at Danny. "Keep the range at medium and don't let the pot boil dry," she said. Danny nodded with the terrified conscientiousness of someone who has just been handed a responsibility they're not sure they can handle. "You can do it," she said. "It's just heat management." She got her coat. The ride to the Schreiber place took 40 minutes on a road that was rough with frozen ruts and required the horses to be careful about their footing the whole way. Rowan rode without talking much, which she had learned was how he processed things he was worried about. Not silence from discomfort, but silence from genuine internal work, the kind of thinking that didn't need a listener. She let him have it. The Schreiber farm was smaller than she had pictured from the table conversation. A frame house, and a single barn, and a lean-to that had clearly been added later when the original plan hadn't been quite enough. The fences were adequate, but not generous. It was the homestead of a family that had worked hard and gotten to stable without quite getting to secure, which was exactly the kind of situation Halverson and Crane looked for. Mrs. Schreiber, her name was Clara, Mabel had learned over the meal at the ranch, came to the door before they had finished tying the horses. She looked at both of them, and then said, to Mabel, "I told Henrik not to sign anything." "Good," Mabel said. "Can we come in?" They sat at the Schreiber's kitchen table, which was smaller than the one at the ranch and had a crack along one edge that had been repaired with a wooden wedge, and Rowan spread the survey papers out and went through them with Henrik Schreiber, while Mabel sat across from Clara and watched the other woman's face. Clara Schreiber was 35 or thereabouts, with the look of a woman who had been making do for long enough that it had become her natural state. She listened to Rowan's explanation of the title documentation with the focused attention of someone who understood that she was being told something important and was going to make sure she understood it. When Rowan finished, Henrik looked at the papers for a moment and then said, "So the claim they made about the irregularity is fabricated," Rowan said. "The county title was properly recorded in 1871, and the September survey confirmed every boundary and water right. There is no irregularity." Henrik looked at his wife. Clara said, "The man who came with Marsh, the one who talked about the title." "Yes, these," Mabel said. "He was very certain about it," Clara said. "He used a lot of legal language." "He was counting on the language being persuasive without being verifiable," Mabel said. "Did he show you any documentation, any actual records from the county land office?" Clara was quiet. "He described them," Henrik said. "Describing a document and having one are different things," Mabel said. "If the claim were real, he would have had the paperwork in his hand." Clara looked at the survey papers on the table. She looked at them for a long time. Then she said, "What do they actually want? Really want, not what they say they want." "Water rights," Rowan said. "The creek that runs through my property originates on the North Ridge and comes through 3 other parcels before it leaves the valley. If they control those parcels, they control the water, and they can develop the lower territory without the current landholders blocking access." "What does developing mean?" Clara said. "Mining access, most likely," Rowan said. "The geological surveys from 2 years ago showed silver-bearing ore on the west slope. Getting to it requires water, lots of water. The creek provides it." The kitchen was quiet. A child's voice came from somewhere in the back of the house, not distressed, just present, the ordinary background sound of a house with children in it. Henrik said, "Silver." "Yes," Rowan said. Henrik looked at the table. He had the expression of a man who had just understood that the game he was playing had a different set of stakes than he had thought, and the understanding was not comfortable. Clara said to Mabel directly, "If they get what they want, the mining access, what happens to the farms?" "The creek gets diverted for industrial use," Mabel said. "Your irrigation water is the first thing that goes. After that, the farming becomes marginal. Within 2 or 3 seasons, most of the homesteads in this valley aren't viable." The word sat in the room. Henrik said, "And Marsh knows this." "Marsh is working for people who have mapped this out carefully," Mabel said. "Yes." Clara looked at her husband. Something passed between them in the particular wordless shorthand of a marriage that had been through enough hard decisions together that they had developed a private language for them. Then Clara looked at Mabel and said, "What do you need from us?" "Nothing dramatic," Mabel said. "Don't sign anything until you've talked to Rowan's lawyer. We'll arrange that. Keep talking to Greer and Holt about what you hear from Marsh's people so no one gets isolated into a corner again." She paused. "And if there's a financial situation making you feel like you don't have time for the slow approach, tell us, before you decide you have no choice." The silence that followed had a specific texture. Mabel watched Clara watch Henrik, and she watched Henrik look at the table. Then Henrik said, "We're 3 payments behind on the land loan." The words came out like something that had been held in too long. Rowan said, "Who holds the loan?" "Merchant Bank in Coldwater, Pearson's bank." Rowan and Mabel looked at each other. The same thought arrived in both of them at approximately the same moment. She could see it in his face. "Is Pearson connected to Halverson and Crane?" she said. Rowan said, "I don't know. I've never done business with Pearson." "Worth finding out," she said, "before we assume the loan pressure is separate from everything else." Henrik was looking at both of them. "You think the bank is part of it?" "I think," Mabel said carefully, "that it would be a very effective tool if it were. Threaten the land through the title claim, threaten the finances through the loan, threaten the supplies through the disruption, and tell each family the others are already giving up." She folded her hands. "Any one of those is manageable. All of them at once, aimed at a family that's already tired. That's what breaks people." Clara said quietly, "That's what they were doing." "Yes," Mabel said. The ride back was cold and getting dark fast, the way December evenings did at this elevation. Not gradual, just suddenly dark between one moment and the next. Mabel rode with her chin down in her collar and thought about Pearson's bank and the loan and how many other pieces of this she hadn't found yet. Rowan pulled his horse alongside hers on a straight stretch and said, "Pearson has been in Coldwater for 15 years. I've heard nothing against him." "That doesn't mean nothing," she said. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They rode for a few minutes in silence. "I need to get to Denver," Rowan said, "not the telegraph, in person, with the survey documents. Talk to the lawyer directly and have him look at Halverson and Crane's land acquisition history in the other counties." "Can you do it before the past gets worse?" "If I leave Monday," he said, "and don't stay more than 4 days." She thought about that. 4 days with Rowan gone, the road unpredictable, the situation with the Schreibers unresolved, and whatever Marcia's next move was still waiting to happen. "Go," she said. "I'll manage." He looked at her sideways in the dark. "I know you will," he said. "That's not what I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" He was quiet for a moment. They came around a bend, and the lights of the ranch came into view below, warm and solid against the snow. "I'm thinking," he said, "that I've spent 20 years managing this place alone and being reasonably good at it, and in 3 months I've come to rely on your judgment for half of my decisions, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that." Mabel looked at the lights of the ranch. "How do you feel about it?" she said. "Grateful," he said, "and slightly unsettled by the grateful." She almost smiled. "That's a very honest answer." "I've been trying to be honest with you," he said. "It seems only fair given your standards." She rode for a moment without speaking. The ranch was close now, and she could see Danny's silhouette through the kitchen window and the glow of the range he had apparently managed to keep going, which was a relief she didn't show. "Rowan," she said. "Yes." "The unsettled part," she said. "I understand it. But you should know that relying on another person's judgment isn't the same as losing your own. It's additional information." She paused. "You're still the one making the decisions." He was quiet for a moment. "Not always," he said. She let that sit. They came into the yard and Pete came out to take the horses, and Danny appeared at the kitchen door with the specific face of a person who has kept something from burning down and is very proud of this. And Mabel went inside and checked the range and found it exactly where she'd told him to keep it, and she told him he'd done well, which made him stand half an inch taller. She started supper. Rowan left for Denver on Monday as planned, with the survey documents and a letter of introduction from the county clerk that his lawyer had requested. He was gone 4 days and came back on a Friday evening with cold reddened cheeks and the particular focused look of a man who has learned something he needed to know. He sat down at the kitchen table before he'd even taken his coat off and said, "Pearson's bank was capitalized in part by a Denver investment group in 1879. Mabel set down what she was doing and sat across from him. "Halverson and Crane is a subsidiary of that investment group," Rowan said. "Pearson doesn't know he's working for them, or if he does, he's been careful about it. But the Schreiber loan was originated through a portfolio that Halverson and Crane's parent company holds." The kitchen was very quiet. "So the loan pressure," Mabel said, "is not separate from the offer pressure," Rowan said. "It's the same hand." She looked at the table. She thought about Henrik Schreiber saying 3 payments behind in the particular voice of a man who has been carrying something heavy in private. She thought about what it meant that the weight had been placed there deliberately. "What did your lawyer say?" she said. "He's filing a complaint with the Territorial Land Office next week. The manufactured title claim is enough on its own. He has documentation of the same tactic being used in 2 other counties. But the bank connection makes the overall pattern clearer." Rowan took off his coat finally and hung it on the hook behind the door. "He thinks we have a strong case. He also thinks Halverson and Crane know they have a limited window before the complaint lands, which means they'll move harder and faster in the next few weeks." "Marsh will come back," she said. "Soon," Rowan said. "Yes." She looked at the window. Outside it was dark and the temperature had gone under 0, and the stars were the sharp cold stars of deep winter at high altitude, the kind that look close enough to affect you, and were in fact so far away the distance didn't mean anything to the human mind. "We need everyone together before he does," she said. "Greer, Holt, Schreiber, Pollard, all of them, up here, before Marsh arrives with his next version of the story." "When?" "This weekend," she said, "if the road allows it." He nodded. He looked tired from the Denver trip, but it was the tired of a man who had done something useful, not the tired of defeat. Mabel, he said. She looked at him. He said, "When this is over," he stopped. He looked at the table and then back at her, and she saw in his face the expression she had been aware of for weeks without letting herself name it. Not gratitude, not reliance. Something that had been building slowly in the particular way things built slowly in people who had been disappointed enough times to stop rushing toward what they wanted. The range ticked in the silence. She said, "When this is over, we'll still be here." It was not everything he had been moving toward saying, and both of them knew it. But it was true, and it was solid, and for now it was enough. The same way the cold pantry had been enough, and the drained cellar had been enough, and the Greers coming up the mountain had been enough. Each piece of the thing holding long enough to build the next piece on top of it. He nodded once, and she went back to the range, and the kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of food. And outside the window, the deep Colorado winter sat against the walls of the valley with all its weight and all its indifference, and the lights of the ranch stayed on. Marsh came back on a Wednesday. He came with the younger man this time, the one Pete had described as having the manner of a lawyer, and they came in a proper enclosed coach instead of the light buggy, which told Mabel something about how seriously Halverson and Crane were taking this round. A heavier vehicle meant they expected to be here longer. It meant they had brought more than an offer. She saw the coach from the kitchen window at 9:30 in the morning, and she went to the front room and said to Rowan, who was at the desk with the water rights documentation, "They're here." He looked up. "Both of them," she said, "and they brought a closed coach." He set down his pen and stood up and straightened his coat. Not a new coat, still the working coat he wore every day, which she had come to understand was a deliberate choice rather than a careless one, and walked to the front door and opened it before they had finished tying off the horses in the yard. She came and stood beside him in the doorway, not behind him, beside him. Marsh saw them both, and his professional face did the small reorganization she had learned to read by now. The younger man. She would learn his name was Gideon Cole, and that he was in fact a lawyer trained in Denver and currently employed by Halverson and Crane's parent investment group. Looked at Rowan and then at Mabel with the particular attention of someone who has been briefed on a situation and is comparing the briefing to the reality. Whatever he had been told about Mabel Whitlock Ashcroft, the reality was requiring adjustment. She could see it happening and did not feel anything in particular about it, because she had long ago stopped caring about the adjustments people made when they encountered her. What she cared about was what they did after. "Mr. Ashcroft," Marsh said with the warmth, "good of you to be available." "Come in," Rowan said. They sat in the front room. Mabel sat in the corner chair where she had sat during the gathering of families 2 weeks prior, and Rowan sat across from the two men, and nobody offered anyone coffee, which was a choice that communicated something. Cole opened a leather case and set documents on the low table between them with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he had and in what order. "Mr. Ashcroft," he said, "we want to be direct with you today. Our client has authorized an offer that represents full market value for this property, surveyed and certified. The number," he slid a paper across, "is considerably above what you would achieve in any other transaction at this time." Rowan looked at the paper. He looked at it for a reasonable amount of time, the way an honest person would look at a large number. Then he set it back on the table. "No," he said. Cole had anticipated this. "Before you finalize that position," he said, "I want to make you aware of some information that may be relevant to your decision." He pulled a second document from the case. "The County Land Office has opened a preliminary review of title documentation for properties in this region, including yours. We understand this may be resolved without consequence, but during a review period, certain transactions, financing, easement agreements, water use contracts, may be subject to challenge. We want to make sure you have complete information." Rowan looked at the document. He did not touch it. Mabel said, from her corner, "Mr. Cole." Both men looked at her. Cole with wariness, Marsh with the particular resigned expression of someone who had encountered this before and had not enjoyed it. "The preliminary review you're describing," she said, "is that the same review that was described to the Schreiber family 2 weeks ago?" A pause. Because the Schreiber family mentioned it to us, she said. And when we looked into it, we found no record of any such review having been opened. We wrote to the county land office directly and received a written response confirming that no review is currently active for any property in this valley. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded paper, which she held out toward Cole without standing up. That's the response, dated last week. Cole looked at the paper. He did not reach for it. We also found it interesting, she continued, setting the paper on the side table beside her chair, that the same tactic, a described review, no documentation, exactly enough legal language to sound credible to a family without legal representation, appears in the record of Halverson and Crane's acquisitions in 2 other counties over the past 4 years. Our lawyer in Denver has those records. He filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office 10 days ago. The front room was quiet enough that the fire in the hearth was audible. Marsh said carefully, "Mrs. Ashcroft, we have no interest in—" "I know what your interest is," she said. "I've known since October. The silver ore on the west slope needs water. This valley's creek provides it. You need the land between the ore and the water, and you've been purchasing it parcel by parcel while making sure each family believes they're isolated and out of options." She looked at him with the same direct steadiness she looked at everything. That approach worked in the other counties because no one saw the full pattern until it was complete. It hasn't worked here because we've been talking to each other. Marsh looked at Rowan. He was recalculating, she could see it, moving from the approach that hadn't worked toward what was still available to him. He was not a stupid man. That was the thing about careful liars. They were rarely stupid. They adapted. "Mr. Ashcroft," Marsh said, turning away from Mabel deliberately. A small power move, the only one he had left. "The offer on the table is real, and the number is fair. Whatever concerns have been raised about our methodology, the underlying offer—" "Rowan," Mabel said. He looked at her. She gave him the smallest nod. It meant, "You have this." Rowan looked at Marsh. He looked at him the way he had looked at the man on Gerald Fitch's porch, with the particular quiet that was not patience, but something underneath patience, something older. "The valley is not for sale," he said. "The water rights are not for sale. If your client attempts to pursue the false title claim through any channel, my lawyer will present the territorial complaint and the comparative record from the other counties." He paused. "And if anyone connected to Halverson and Crane approaches any family in this valley again, we'll add harassment to the complaint." Cole had gone still in the precise way of a man who is doing legal calculations. Marsh looked at the offer paper still sitting on the low table. He looked at it for a moment and then reached out and picked it up and folded it and put it in his inside coat pocket. The gesture had a finality to it that Mabel recognized, not the finality of a man who had accepted defeat, but the finality of a man who had accepted that this particular approach was finished. "We'll be in touch," he said. "You don't need to be," Rowan said. They left. Mabel and Rowan stood in the front room and listened to the coach move out of the yard and down the road. Pete came to the front window and watched it go, then turned and looked at both of them with an expression that was working hard not to be openly delighted. "Is that it?" Pete said. "No," Mabel said, "but it's the end of this part." What she meant, and what the following weeks confirmed, was that Halverson and Crane did not give up. They recalculated. The false title claim was quietly dropped, which Rowan's lawyer confirmed in a letter that arrived in January. Marsh stopped making personal visits. The supply disruptions ceased, though whether this was because they had abandoned the tactic or because winter had made the road unreliable enough that disruption required no assistance was impossible to say. What changed instead was more subtle. In February, they learned through Holt, who had contacts in the timber industry that extended further than the valley, that Halverson and Crane had filed for a water use permit directly with the territorial authority, attempting to claim survey rights over the creek's headwaters on the North Ridge, which fell above all the privately held land in the valley. It was a move that bypassed the individual landholders entirely and went after the source. It was, Mabel thought when Rowan brought her the information, actually cleverer than what they had been doing before. She told him so. "How is that useful to know?" he said. "Because clever moves take longer to prepare," she said. "And longer to prepare means more documentation. And more documentation means more record of what they've been doing overall." She looked at the letter from Holt. Send this to your lawyer. The Headwaters claim, combined with the false title record and the complaint already filed. This isn't three separate problems. It's a pattern. And a pattern is what you need to make a regulatory body pay attention. He sent it. What came back from the Denver lawyer 6 weeks later, in a letter that arrived on a morning in late February when the pass was beginning to open and the first signs of something less than full winter were appearing in the quality of the light, was better than they had expected and also less complete than they had hoped, which was how things usually were when they were real rather than fictional. The territorial authority had denied the Headwaters permit. The denial cited the existing water rights documentation, the ongoing complaint from Rowan's lawyer, and, this was the part that surprised Mabel slightly, a letter submitted by August Holt, the Greer family, Henrik and Clara Schreiber, and the Pollards collectively objecting to the permit on the grounds that it would compromise established agricultural water use in the valley. 4 families who 3 months ago had been making decisions in isolation, unaware that any of the others were being pressured, had signed a single document and submitted it through a lawyer's office. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it on the kitchen table where Rowan would see it when he came in, and she went back to the range. He came in at midday, read it again, and sat down. Pete came in behind him, read it over his shoulder, and said, "That's done then?" "The permit is done," Mabel said. "The company itself isn't done, but they've lost the 2 tools that were most likely to work here, the individual pressure and the regulatory route. What they have left is slower and more expensive and harder to make look clean." "Meaning," Pete said. "Meaning they'll probably go find an easier valley," she said. Rowan was looking at the letter. He had not said anything yet. She had learned not to rush his silences because they were not empty. They were full of something he was working through, and interrupting them produced shorter and less honest responses than waiting did. After a while he said, "The families. They did that without being asked." "Yes," she said. "You didn't arrange it." "No." He set the letter down. "Holt came to me in January," he said. "When you were dealing with the fence situation in the East Pasture, he said he wanted to know if there was anything useful he could do on the legal side. I told him to talk to the lawyer." He paused. "I didn't know he was going to gather the others." Mabel looked at the letter on the table. "That's what happens," she said, "when people feel like they're part of something." The words came out simply, without weight on them, because simple and true things didn't need weight. But she felt what was behind them. The long accumulation of those months, the first night with the ledger, the drainage work in cold ground, the Greer boy on horseback with his frost-reddened face, Clara Schreiber saying, "What do you need from us?" It hadn't been a plan exactly. She didn't believe in plans that were too detailed because detailed plans assumed the world would cooperate, and the world consistently declined to do so. It had been something simpler: pay attention, do the next necessary thing, keep people from feeling alone. That was all. And it was not small. March arrived, and with it the opening of the pass and the return of the world from below. The change was not dramatic. It was not one day impassable and the next day clear. It was a gradual loosening, the road becoming passable for a light horse before it was passable for a wagon before it was safe for a loaded supply run. Rowan made the first proper supply trip in late March and came back with materials for the east fence repair and news from Coldwater that confirmed, in the indirect way that small-town information always confirmed things, that Halverson and Crane had shifted their attention to a different region to the south. He reported this at supper as a fact without celebration, because he was not a man who celebrated things he was still holding lightly, and she understood that about him. But Pete celebrated it fully and with great enthusiasm, and Danny celebrated it by eating an extra portion of everything. And Walt sat at the end of the table with something that was as close to satisfaction as his face generally allowed. And the kitchen was loud in a way it hadn't been all winter, and Mabel sat in the middle of it and felt something she had to be careful about naming because she had a habit of not trusting good things until they had held up under examination. After supper, Rowan found her in the cold pantry doing the seasonal accounting, cataloging what remained against what had been used, calculating what the winter had actually cost against what she had projected back in October. She had been right on most of it and wrong on the firewood, which had been higher than projected because of the extended cold snap, and wrong on the dried beans, which had been lower because she had improved how she was using them midwinter. She was making notes on both. He stood in the pantry doorway and watched her work and said, "What's the verdict?" "We came through with reasonable margin," she said. "Not as much as I would have liked, but more than we needed. The root cellar drainage made the difference. We had no spoilage loss this year." "Compared to a third loss last year," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "The Schreibers made it," he said. "I talked to Henrik today at the supply point. They're 3 months behind on the loan still, but he's already written to the bank to arrange a restructure. Clara has apparently been writing to a cousin in Pueblo who may be able to advance them enough to clear the overdue amount." "Good," she said. She wrote something in her notebook. "And the loan. Did your lawyer ever fully confirm the Pearson connection?" "Confirmed enough," Rowan said. "The parent investment group is on record. It won't result in anything legal in the short term, but it's documented if it ever matters." She nodded and closed the notebook. He was still in the doorway. She turned and looked at him. "You have something to say," she said. "I have several things," he said. "I've been trying to work out the order." She waited. He came into the pantry and stood near the shelf of preserved carrots and looked at her with the expression she had first caught on the wagon road coming up to the valley, and had seen more clearly each time since. The expression of a man who has spent a long time believing that the honest version of things was always disappointing and has encountered evidence to the contrary and doesn't entirely know what to do with it yet. "When I wrote that letter to the agency," he said, "I was 40 years old, and I had been on this mountain for 12 years, and I had made the ranch exactly what I wanted it to be, and I was lonelier than I had admitted to myself." He said it plainly, without self-pity. "And I thought, maybe someone practical, someone who wouldn't expect things I couldn't give, someone who would just be here and make the place function." She looked at him. "That's not what I got," he said. "I know," she said. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "I told you months ago it wasn't." He looked at the shelf. "What I got was someone who reorganized my entire operation in 6 weeks and built a community out of a valley full of strangers and saw through a land scheme that I'd been half blinded to because I was too close to it." He paused. "And who cleaned a cut on my hand without making a production of it and told me I was wrong about my father's strategy without being unkind about it, and has made me feel like a fool approximately a dozen times in the best possible way." She looked at him carefully. "Is there a question in here somewhere?" He looked at her directly. "I want to know if this is what you want," he said. "Not what you came for, not what was practical, what you actually want." The pantry was cold, and the shelves around them were evidence of months of careful work. And outside the small high window above the shelf, the March sky was the particular thin blue of altitude at the end of winter, bright and cold, and completely indifferent to human arrangements. Mabel thought about Springfield, about the chair in Gerald Fitch's lobby, about 3 men who had written letters retracting their interest once they understood what she looked like, about the decision she had made to answer Rowan's letter, not because she was desperate, but because she recognized something in the plain sentence at the bottom of his 3rd paragraph. "I am not looking for someone perfect. I am looking for someone honest." That sounded like someone describing her. "This valley," she said, "is the first place in my life where I have been entirely what I am and had that be enough." She paused. "And you are the first person who has ever thanked me for how I worked, rather than apologizing for the fact that I worked at all." Another pause. "Yes, this is what I want." He looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she had not seen him do. He reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the notebook, and he held it there, not as a gesture of romance exactly, but as the physical equivalent of something being stated plainly, a fact being registered. She looked at his hand, with its healed cut on the back, and did not pull away. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They stood there for a moment in the cold pantry with the preserved carrots and the documented margins and the evidence of a winter successfully navigated, and it was not a dramatic moment, and it was not beautiful in any conventional way, and both of them had too much character and too much history and too many edges that didn't smooth down easily for this to be the kind of thing that happened in stories where people became simpler versions of themselves at the resolution. It was real. That was what it was. It was the specific realness of 2 people who had been honest with each other consistently enough that they had earned the right to stand close. He let go of her hand and she tucked the notebook under her arm, and they went back to the kitchen. Spring came the way it always comes at high elevation, later than you expected, faster than you were ready for, with a quality of sudden insistence that made the previous months feel like they had been holding their breath. The snow came off the south meadow first, then the east pasture, and the creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, and Walt moved his sheep back to the upper grazing with the satisfaction of a man returning to his proper domain. The Greer family came up in April with Pollard and his son, and they brought lumber because the east fence repair had been visible from the lower road, and Greer had decided without being asked that helping with it was a reasonable thing to do. Rowan accepted the help without making a ceremony of it, which was the right response, and they spent 2 days working the fence line together and came into Mabel's kitchen in the evenings tired and smelling of sawdust and cold air, and ate like the work they had done deserved, which it did. The Schreibers came later in May, when the road was fully reliable, and Clara had a package of seeds she had ordered from a catalog in Pueblo. Varieties that would do better at this elevation than what she had been trying to grow, information she had gotten from Mabel during the winter by letter. The two of them having developed a correspondence that was practical in content and warmer in tone than either of them had fully acknowledged. Clara came into the kitchen and set the seeds on the table and said, "The cousin came through. The loan is restructured." "I heard," Mabel said. "Sit down. I'll make coffee." Clara sat down and looked around the kitchen, at the organized stores, at the cold pantry built into the north wall, at the notebook on the counter where Mabel kept her running accounts. She said, "I want you to know something." Mabel brought the coffee. "When Marsh came to us the third time," Clara said, "Henrik was going to sign. He didn't tell me until afterward. He sat down at that table and picked up the pen and then put it down again, and didn't tell me why until the week after your husband came to see us." She held her coffee cup with both hands. "He said the reason he put the pen down was that he kept thinking about the supply sledge, about how fast it came when the storm took out our wall. He said he kept thinking, someone who sends help that fast isn't someone you sign away from." Mabel looked at the table. "I'm telling you because you should know," Clara said. "What you did mattered in ways that weren't obvious." Mabel said, after a moment, "Henrik put the pen down. That was him." "You gave him a reason to," Clara said. There was a particular kind of argument that was not worth having because the person making it was right, and Mabel recognized this as one of those, and so she said nothing more about it and refilled the coffee, and they talked about the seeds and the planting schedule and the elk that had been coming through the lower meadow at dawn, which was either beautiful or a problem depending on how you felt about your fence line. August Holt came in June with a proposition that Mabel had not anticipated and Rowan had also not anticipated, which meant it was something none of them had manufactured and was therefore interesting. Holt sat at the kitchen table, so he had developed a habit of showing up for meals when he was in the area, which everyone had simply accepted as the way things were now, and said, without preamble, "I want to file a joint water use agreement. All the landholders in the valley. A single document registered with the territorial authority that establishes collective stewardship of the creek from headwaters to the valley floor." Rowan looked at him. "That's more complex than individual rights agreements." "Yes," Holt said. "It's also much harder to pick apart one piece at a time." Mabel looked at Holt. He was eating her stew with the focused appreciation of a man who lived alone and had not eaten well in a long time before these kitchen visits had become a habit. And he was also, she understood, a man who thought very carefully before he said things, and what he had just said had clearly been thought about for some time. "Is this because of the Headwaters permit attempt?" she said. "Partly," he said, "and partly because what we did with the letter to the territorial authority, signing together, worked better than anything any of us had done alone." He set down his spoon. "We should formalize that, not because of Halverson and Crane specifically, because it's the right structure for a valley that intends to last." Rowan was quiet, looking at the table. Mabel said, "I think he's right." Rowan looked at her. She held his gaze and he knew she meant it. "I'll write to the lawyer," Rowan said. The joint water agreement took 4 months to draft, negotiate between the families, and file. It was not a smooth process. Henrik Schreiber had concerns about the liability clauses. Pollard didn't understand 3 of the provisions, and needed them explained twice in different language, and Holt revised his section of the easement description 3 times before he was satisfied. Mabel sat in on 2 of the meetings because Rowan asked her to and because she noticed things in document language that the others sometimes missed. The way a phrase that sounded reasonable could mean something slightly different when it was the basis of a legal claim. The agreement was filed with the Territorial Authority in October, 1 year and 1 week after Mabel Whitlock had stepped off a stagecoach in Coldwater Station and sat down in Gerald Fitch's lobby and waited for a man she had never met to come and take her up a mountain. The document bore 7 signatures: Rowan Ashcroft and Mabel Ashcroft, August Holt, Thomas Greer, Henrik and Clara Schreiber. Clara had insisted on being listed separately, and no one had argued. James Pollard, 7 signatures on a single page. Rowan brought the filed copy back from Coldwater on a Tuesday and set it on the kitchen table, and Mabel looked at it for a long time without picking it up. She looked at the 7 names and she thought about what each of them had looked like 1 year ago. Greer's son on horseback in the frost, Clara with her hands folded around a coffee cup, Holt studying Pete's carpentry work with a timberman's eye, Schreiber looking at the table when she mentioned financial difficulty. People making the best decisions they could in the dark, with incomplete information, alone. That was most of it, she thought. That was most of what made the hard things hard. Not the hardship itself, but the isolation inside it. The feeling that your specific difficulty was yours alone, that no one else was managing the same weight, that asking for help was an admission of something shameful rather than the most practical thing available. She had felt that herself for most of her life. The particular isolation of a woman whose body made people decide things about her before she'd opened her mouth. Decide she was slow, decide she was weak, decide she wouldn't last a hard winter on a high mountain ranch, decide she was a burden, decide she couldn't possibly be the one keeping the whole operation running when the rancher was on a roof or in Denver or out on a fence line in the snow. She had been decided about by people her entire life. What this year had given her was not the absence of that. People still looked, still recalibrated, still made their adjustments. Marcia's unfinished sentence would not be the last of its kind. She was not naive enough to think the world had changed because one valley in Colorado had organized itself sensibly, but it had given her something that was, in practical terms, more valuable than the world changing. It had given her a place where her actual capacities were the thing that mattered, where the question wasn't what she looked like, but what she saw and what she built, and whether the numbers added up, and whether the food held through February, and whether the people around her felt less alone than they had before she arrived. She was good at those things. She had always been good at those things. She had simply spent 29 years waiting for somewhere that needed them. She picked up the filed agreement and put it in the ledger drawer with the survey documents and the lawyer's letters and the Territorial Authority's permit denial, a record of what had been done and how. Rowan came into the kitchen at midday and found her at the range. He looked at the table and did not see the agreement and looked at the ledger drawer and understood. "Good place for it," he said. "Evidence drawer," she said. "Does it need a label?" She almost smiled. "I think we'll remember what's in it." He sat down at the table, which was his habit now when she was cooking, not to watch exactly, but to be in the room, the way people were in rooms they had learned to consider home. She had come to not mind it. She had come to, on the days when work took him out to the far pasture from early morning, notice its absence. That was not nothing. For a woman who had spent years being practically certain she would live without that particular kind of presence, it was not nothing at all. "The Greer boy came by this morning," Rowan said, "while you were at the cellar." "Which one?" "The oldest, James. He wants to apprentice with Pete, learn the carpentry and the equipment maintenance." He paused. "He asked me, not Pete. I told him to ask Pete." "Good answer," she said. "Pete said yes," Rowan said. "He looked pleased about it." She stirred the pot. Outside the kitchen window, the first-year anniversary of her arrival was presenting itself as a perfect Colorado autumn afternoon. The aspens on the lower ridge gone gold the same way they had been gold when she came up the road in Rowan's wagon. Everything cycling back to its starting point and not quite the same as it had been, which was how time worked when things had actually happened in it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The ridge," she said. where I first saw the valley. You never told me why you built the road that way, coming over that ridge instead of around it." He was quiet for a moment. "My father built the road," he said. "I asked him the same thing when I was old enough to have an opinion about it. He said he built it that way because he wanted anyone coming to this place to see it whole, all at once, before they had time to see it piece by piece." He paused. He thought the first impression mattered. She thought about that, about standing on the wagon bench in the cold October light and looking down at the impossible hidden valley, the stone house, the organized fences, the healthy animals, all of it whole and complete, and nothing like what she had been told. "He was right," she said. "He was right about more things than I gave him credit for," Rowan said, "including the road." She plated the food and brought it to the table and sat across from him, and they ate together the way they had been eating together for a year, with the easy familiarity of people who have learned each other's rhythms and have stopped being careful about it. And the kitchen was warm, and the cold pantry held what it needed to hold, and outside the window the valley went on being what it was. She had been told, all her life, by people who decided things about her at a distance, that the hard life was not for her, that the mountain would break her, that her size was a limitation and her practicality was a substitute for something she lacked, and her presence in a place like this was an imposition on it. She had never believed them exactly, but she had not had evidence against it either, not the kind of evidence that you could stand on. She had it now. Not because everything had gone smoothly. The fences had broken, the storm had been real, the root cellar had rotted stores before she fixed the drainage. Pete had built 2 versions of the pantry frame before he got it right, and the legal battle with Halverson and Crane was not fully closed and might never be fully closed, because that was how those things went in the real world, where problems did not resolve completely so much as they shifted into a form you could manage. But she was here. The valley was intact. The water agreement existed. The families on the lower mountain were talking to each other. The ranch was better organized than it had ever been. And the man across the table from her was a different version of himself than the man who had driven her up the road a year ago. Less contained, less braced for disappointment, more willing to admit that other people's judgment was not always a threat to his own. She had done that. Not alone, but not incidentally. That was what she wanted people to understand, if she could have told them anything. Not that she had triumphed over the people who underestimated her, because triumph was too simple and too clean for what had actually happened. What she wanted them to understand was something quieter and more durable than that. It was that the thing people dismissed in her, the practicality, the willingness to see clearly, the habit of finding the next necessary thing and doing it, was not a consolation prize for the things she supposedly lacked. It was the actual substance. It was the part of a person that held. She had spent years waiting to be seen as something other than her body. And then she had come to a mountain in Colorado and been seen simply and directly as the thing she actually was. Not because the world had become fair, because she had found a specific place and a specific man and a specific set of problems that needed exactly what she had, and she had been paying attention when they arrived. She could not have planned it. She had just stayed honest and kept walking. Rowan pushed back from the table with the particular satisfaction of a man who has eaten well and has work to return to that he does not resent. He picked up his coat from the hook. "East fence this afternoon," he said. "The section Greer helped us put up in April is holding fine, but the north end needs checking." "Take Pete," she said. "The corner post there has been working loose since the freeze." He paused with his coat half on. "How do you know that?" "Because Danny told me 2 weeks ago, and I forgot to tell you," she said. "I'm telling you now." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had stopped trying not to notice. "All right," he said, and finished putting on his coat, and went out. The kitchen was quiet. The fire ticked in the range. The cold pantry door stood half open the way she always left it this time of year, when the external temperature was cold enough to do some of the work. Mabel got up and cleared the plates and put the pot to soak, and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the south meadow where Walt's flock was moving slowly across the grass in the way that sheep move when nothing is threatening them, without urgency, just present, taking the day as it came. The valley held still under the October sky, and the aspens burned gold on the ridge above, And somewhere on the east fence line, her husband was checking a corner post she had remembered to tell him about 2 weeks late. And that was what it was. That was the actual texture of a life that was working. Not perfect, not smooth, not the version anyone tells you about in advance, just real and hers and enough.